Section 13 of Fabian Essays in Socialism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fabian Essays in Socialism, edited by George Bernard Shaw. Industry under Socialism by Annie Besant. There are two ways in which a scheme for a future organization of industry may be constructed. Of these, by far the easier and less useful is the sketching of utopia, an intellectual gymnastic in which a power of coherent and vivid imagination is the one desideratum. The utopist needs no knowledge of facts. Indeed, such a knowledge is a hindrance. For him the laws of social evolution do not exist. He is a law unto himself, and his men and women are not the wayward, spasmodic, irregular organisms of daily life, but automata, obeying the strings he pulls. In a word, he creates, he does not construct. He makes alike his materials and the laws within which they work, adapting them all to an ideal end. In describing a new Jerusalem, the only limits to its perfection are the limits of the writer's imagination. The second way is less attractive, less easy, but more useful. Starting from the present state of society, it seeks to discover the tendencies underlying it, to trace those tendencies to their natural outworking in institutions, and so to forecast not the far-off future, but the next social stage. It fixes its gaze on the vast changes wrought by evolution, not the petty variations made by catastrophes, on the revolutions which transform society, not the transient riots which merely upset thrones and behead kings. This second way I elect to follow, and this paper on industry and socialism therefore starts from William Clark's exposition of the industrial evolution, which has been in progress during the last 150 years. In thus building forward, in thus forecasting the transitions through which society will probably pass, I shall scarcely touch on the ideal social state that will one day exist, and my sketch must lay itself open to all the criticisms which may be levelled against a society not ideally perfect. It is therefore necessary to bear in mind that I am only trying to work out changes practicable among men and women as we know them, always seeking to lay down not what is ideally best, but what is possible, always choosing among the possible changes that which is on the line towards the ideal and will render further approach easier. In fact, this paper is an attempt to answer the how so often heard when socialism is discussed. Large numbers of people accept, wholly or in part, the socialist theory. They are intellectually convinced of its soundness or emotionally attracted by its beauty, but they hesitate to join in its propaganda because they don't see where you are going to begin or don't see where you are going to stop. Both difficulties are disposed of by the fact that we are not going to begin. There will never be a point at which a society crosses from individualism to socialism. The change is ever going forward, and our society is well on the way to socialism. All we can do is to consciously cooperate with the forces at work, and thus render the transition more rapid than it would otherwise be. The third Fabian essay shows us the success of capitalism bringing about a position which is at once intolerable to majority and easy of capture by them. At this point, the destruction of the small industries has broken down most of the gradations which used to exist between the large employer and the hired laborer, and has left in their place a gulf across which a few capitalists and a huge and hungry proletariat face each other. The denial of human sympathy by the employer in his business relations with his hands has taught the hands to regard the employer as outside the pale of their sympathy. The respect of the public conscience for the rights of property, which was at bottom the private interest of each in his own little property, has diminished since the many lost their individual possessions and saw property accumulate in the hands of the few. It is now little more than a tradition inherited from a former social state. The public conscience will soon condone, nay, it will first approve and then demand, the expropriation of capital, which is used anti-socially instead of socially, and which belongs to that impersonal abstraction, a company, instead of to our next-door neighbor. To the average person, it is one thing for the state to seize the little shop of James Smith who married our sister, or the thriving business of our Sam who works early and late for his living, and quite another when James and Sam, ruined by a big company made up of shareholders of whom nobody knows anything but that they pay low wages and take high dividends, have been obliged to become hired servants of the company instead of owning their own shops and machinery. Whose interest will it be to protest against the state taking over the capital and transforming James and Sam from wage slaves at the mercy of a foreman into shareholders and public functionaries with a voice in the management of the business in which they are employed? Let us suppose, then, that the evolution of the capitalist system has proceeded but a little further along the present lines, concentrating the control of industry and increasingly substituting labor-saving machinery for human beings. It is being accompanied, and must continue to be accompanied, by a growth of the numbers of the unemployed. These numbers may ebb and flow as some of the waves of a rising tide run forward some feet and then a few touch a lower level. But as the tide rises despite the fluctuations of the ripples, so the numbers of the unemployed will increase despite transient mountings and fallings. With these, probably, will begin the tentative organization of industry by the state. But this organization will soon be followed by the taking over by the community of some of the great trusts. The division of the country into clearly defined areas, each with its elected authority, is essential to any effective scheme of organization. It is one of the symptoms of the coming change that, in perfect unconsciousness of the nature of his act, Mr. Ritchie has established the commune. He has divided England into districts ruled by county councils, and has thus created the machinery without which socialism was impracticable. True, he has only made an outline which needs to be filled in, but socialists can fill in, whereas they had no power to outline. It remains to give every adult a vote in the election of councillors, to shorten their term of office to a year, to pay the councillors so that the public may have a right to the whole of their working time, to give the councils power to take and hold land, a reform already asked for by the Liberal and Radical Union, a body not consciously socialist, and to remove all legal restrictions so as to leave them as free to act corporately as an individual is to act individually. These measures accomplished, the rapidity with which our institutions are socialized depends on the growth of socialism among the people. It is essential to the stability of the changed forms of industry that they shall be made by the people, not imposed upon them. Hence the value of Mr. Ritchie's gift of local government, enabling each locality to move swiftly or slowly, to experiment on a comparatively small scale, even to blunder without widespread disaster. The mot d'ordre for socialists now is convert the electors and capture the county councils. These councils, administering local affairs, with the national executive administering national affairs, are all destined to be turned into effective industrial organizers, and the unit of administration must depend on the nature of the industry. The post, the telegraph, the railways, the canals, and the great industries capable of being organized into trusts will, so far as we can see now, be best administered, each from a single centre for the whole kingdom. Tramways, gasworks, waterworks, and many of the smaller productive industries will be best managed locally. In marking the lines of division, convenience and experience must be our guides. The demarcations are of expediency, not of principle. The first great problem that will press on the county council for solution will be that of the unemployed. Wisely or unwisely, it will have to deal with them. Wisely, if it organizes them for productive industry. Unwisely, if it opens relief works and tries, like an enlarged bumble, to shirk the difficulty by enforcing barren and oppressive toil upon outlawed wretches at the expense of the rest of the community. Many of the unemployed are unskilled labourers. A minority are skilled. They must first be registered as skilled and unskilled, and the former enrolled under their several trades. Then can begin the rural organization of labour on county farms, held by the county councils. The council will have its agricultural committee, charged with the administrative details, and this committee will choose well-trained, practical agriculturists as directors of the farm business. To the county farm will be drafted from the unemployed in the towns, the agricultural labourers who have wandered townwards in search of work, and many of the unskilled labourers. On these farms, every advantage of machinery and every discovery in agricultural science should be utilized to the utmost. The crops should be carefully chosen with reference to soil and aspect, cereals, fruit, vegetables, and the culture adapted to the crop, the one aim being to obtain the largest amount of produce with the least expenditure of human labor. Whether land is most profitably cultivated in large or small parcels depends on the crop, and in the great area of the county farm, la grande et la petite culture might each have its place. Economy would also gain by the large number of labourers under the direction of the head farmer, since they could be concentrated when required at any given spot, as in harvest time, and dispersed to work at the more continuous kinds of tillage when the seasonal task was over. To these farms must also be sent some skilled labourers from among the unemployed, shoemakers, tailors, smiths, carpenters, etc., so that the county farm may be self-supporting as far as it can be without waste of productive power. All the small industries necessary in daily life should be carried on in it, and an industrial commune thus built up. The democracy might be trusted to ordain that an 8-hour day and a comfortable home should be part of the life conditions on the county farm. Probably each large farm would soon have its central store with its adjacent railway station, in addition to the ordinary farm buildings, its public hall in the center of the farm village to be used for lectures, concerts, and entertainments of all sorts, its public schools, elementary and technical, and soon, possibly from the outset, its public meal room, saving time and trouble to housewives, and while economizing fuel and food, giving a far greater choice and variety of dishes. Large dwellings with suites of rooms might perhaps replace old-fashioned cottages, for it is worth noting, as showing the tendency already existing among ourselves to turn from isolated self-dependence to the advantages of associated living, that many modern flats are being built without servants' rooms, the house cleaning, etc., being done by persons engaged for the whole block, and the important meals being taken at restaurants so as to avoid the trouble and expense of private cooking. It will surely be well in initiating new organizations of industry to start on the most advanced lines and take advantage of every modern tendency towards less isolated modes of living. Socialists must work hard to make municipal dealings with the unemployed avenues to the higher life, not grudging utilization of pauper labor. And as they know their aim, and the other political parties live but from hand to mouth, they ought to be able to exercise a steady and uniform pressure, which, just because it is steady and uniform, will impress its direction on the general movement. The node of urban industrial organization, as of all other, must be that each person shall be employed to do what he can do best, not what he does worst. It may be desirable for a man to have 2 trades, but watchmaking and stone-breaking are not convenient alternative occupations. Where the skilled unemployed belong to trades carried on everywhere, such as baking, shoemaking, tailoring, etc., they should be employed at their own trades in municipal workshops, and their products garnered in municipal stores. These workshops will be under the direction of foremen, thoroughly skilled workmen, able to superintend and direct as though in private employment. The working day must be of 8 hours, and the wages, for the present, the trades union minimum. Then, instead of tailors and shoemakers tramping the streets ragged and barefoot, the tailors will be making clothes, and the shoemakers boots and shoes. And the shoemaker, with the wages he earns, will buy the tailor's products, and the tailor the shoemaker's. Then, instead of supporting the unemployed by rates levied on the employed, they will be set to work to supply their own necessities, and be producers of the wealth they consume instead of consuming, in enforced idleness or barren penal exercises in the stone yard, the wealth produced by others. Masons, bricklayers, plumbers, carpenters, etc., might be set to work in building decent and pleasant dwellings, in the style of the blocks or flats, not of the barracks called model dwellings, for the housing of the municipal industrial army. I lay stress on the pleasantness of the dwellings. These places are to be dwellings for citizens, not prisons for paupers, and there is no possible reason why they should not be made attractive. Under socialism, the workers are to be the nation, and all that is best is for the service. For, be it remembered, our faces are set towards socialism, and our organization of labor is to be on socialist lines. It is very likely that among the unemployed some will be found whose trade can only be carried on by large numbers, and is not one of the industries of the town into which their unlucky fate has drifted them. These should be sent into municipal service in the towns where the trade is the staple industry, there to be employed in the municipal factory. Concurrently with this rural and urban organization of non-centralized industries will proceed the taking over of the great centralized industries, centralized for us by capitalists, who thus unconsciously pave the way for their own supersession. Everything which has been organized into a trust and has been worked for a time in the trust fashion is ripe for appropriation by the community. All minerals would be most properly worked in this centralized way, and it will probably be found most convenient to work all the big productive industries, such as the textile, in similar fashion. It is idle to say that it cannot be done by the state when it is being done by a ring of capitalists. A local board, an iron board, a tin board can be as easily held responsible to the nation as to a casual crowd of shareholders. There need be no dislocation of production in making the transference. The active organizers and directors of a trust do not necessarily or even usually own the capital invested in it. If the state finds it convenient to hire these organizers and directors, there is nothing to prevent its doing so for as long or as short a period as it chooses. The temporary arrangements made with them during the transition period must be governed by expediency. Let us pause for a moment to estimate the position so far. The unemployed have been transformed into communal workers. In the country-owned great farms, improvements of the bonanza farms in America, in the towns in various trades. Public stores for agricultural and industrial products are open in all convenient places and filled with the goods thus communally produced. The great industries, worked as trusts, are controlled by the state instead of by capitalist rings. The private capitalist, however, will still be in business, producing and distributing on his own account in competition with the communal organizations, which at present will have occupied only part of the industrial field. But apart from a pressure which will be recognized when we come to deal with the remuneration of labor, these private enterprises will be carried on under circumstances of ever-increasing difficulty. In face of the orderly communal arrays playing into each other's hands with the credit of the country behind them, the ventures of the private capitalist will be at as great a disadvantage as the cottage industries of the last century in face of the factory industries of our own period. The trusts have taught us how to drive competing capitals out of the market by associated capitals. The central boards or county councils will be able to utilize this power of association further than any private capitalists. Thus, the economic forces which replaced the workshop by the factory will replace the private shop by the municipal store and the private factory by the municipal one. And the advantages of greater concentration of capital and of the association of labor will not be the only ones enjoyed by the communal workers. All waste will be checked, every labor-saving appliance utilized to the utmost, where the object is the production of general wealth and not the production of profit to be appropriated by a class. For in the one case it is the interest of the producers to produce, inasmuch as their enjoyment depends on the productivity of their labor, whereas in the other it is their interest to sterilize their labor as far as they dare, in order to render more of it necessary and so keep up its price. As the organization of the public industry extends and supplants more and more the individualist producer, the probable demand will be more easily estimated and the supply regulated to meet it. The municipalities and central boards will take the place of the competing small capitalists and the rings of large ones, and production will become ordered and rational instead of anarchical and reckless as it is today. After a while, the private producers will disappear, not because there will be any law against individual production, but because it will not pay. No one will care to face the worries, the harassments, the anxieties of individualists struggling for livelihood, when ease, freedom, and security can be enjoyed in the communal services. The best form of management during the transition period, and possibly for a long time to come, will be through the communal councils, which will appoint committees to superintend the various branches of industry. These committees will engage the necessary manager and foreman for each shop, factory, etc., and will hold the power of dismissal as of appointment. I do not believe that the direct election of the manager and foreman by the employees would be found to work well in practice or to be consistent with the discipline necessary in carrying on any large business undertaking. It seems to me better that the commune should elect its council, thus keeping under its own control the general authority, but should empower the Council to select the officials, so that the power of selection and dismissal within the various subdivisions should lie with the nominees of the whole commune instead of with the particular group immediately concerned. There is no practical difficulty in the way of the management of the ordinary productive industries, large or small. The trusts and cooperation have, between them, solved, or put us in the way of solving, all problems connected with these. But there are difficulties in connection with the industries concerned in the production of such commodities as books and newspapers. During the transitional stage, these difficulties will not arise, but when all industries are carried on by the commune or the nation, how will books and newspapers be produced? I only throw out the following suggestions. Printing, like baking, tailoring, shoemaking, is a communal rather than a national industry. Suppose we had printing offices controlled by the communal council. The printing committee might be left free to accept any publication it thought valuable, as a private firm today may take the risk of publication, the arrangement with the author being purchased outright or royalty on copies sold, in each case so much to be put to his credit at the communal bank. But there are many authors whose goods are desired by no one. It would be absurd to force the community to publish all minor poetry. Why not accept the principle that in every case where the printing committee declines to print at the communal risk, the author may have his work printed by transferring from his credit at the communal bank to the account of the printing committee sufficient to cover the cost of printing. The committee should have no power to refuse to print where the cost was covered. Thus, liberty of expression would be guarded as a constitutional right, while the community would not be charged with the cost of printing every stupid effusion that its fond composer might deem worthy of publicity. Newspapers might be issued on similar terms, and it would always be open to individuals or to groups of individuals to publish anything they pleased on covering the cost of publication. With the comparative affluence which would be enjoyed by each member of the community, anyone who really cared to reach the public ear would be able to do so by diminishing his expenditure in other directions. Another difficulty which will meet us, although not immediately, is the competition for employment in certain pleasanter branches of industry. At present, an unemployed person would catch eagerly at the chance of any well-paid work he was able to perform. If he were able both to set type and to stitch coats, he would not dream of grumbling if he were by chance offered the job he liked the less of the two. He would be only too glad to get either. But it is quite possible that as the vast amelioration of life conditions proceeds, Jeshurun will wax fat and kick if, when he prefers to make microscopic lenses, he is desired to make mirrors. Under these circumstances, Jeshurun will, I fear, have to accommodate himself to the demand. If the number of people engaged in making lenses suffices to meet the demand for lenses, Jeshurun must consent to turn his talents for the time to mirror making. After all, his state will not be very pitiable. Though socialism will have failed, it is true, to make 2 + 2 = 5. This, however, hardly solves the general question as to the apportioning of laborers to the various forms of labor. But a solution has been found by the ingenious author of Looking Backward from AD 2000. Leaving young men and women free to choose their employments, he would equalize the rates of volunteering by equalizing the attractions of the trades. In many cases, natural bent, left free to develop itself during a lengthened educational term, will determine the choice of avocation. Human beings are fortunately very varied in their capacities and tastes. That which attracts one repels another. But there are unpleasant and indispensable forms of labor which one would imagine can attract none. mining, sewer cleaning, etc. These may be rendered attractive by making the hours of labor in them much shorter than the normal working day of pleasanter occupations. Many a strong, vigorous man would greatly prefer a short spell of disagreeable work to a long one at a desk. As it is well to leave the greatest possible freedom to the individual, this equalizing of advantages in all trades would be far better than any attempt to perform the impossible task of choosing an employment for each. A person would be sure to hate any work into which he was directly forced, even though it were the very one he would have chosen had he been left to himself. Further, much of the most disagreeable and laborious work might be done by machinery, as it would be now if it were not cheaper to exploit a helot class. When it became illegal to send small boys up chimneys did not cease to be swept. A machine was invented for sweeping them. Coal cutting might now be done by machinery instead of by a man lying on his back, picking away over his head at the imminent risk of his own life. But the machine is much dearer than men, so the miners continue to have their chests crushed in by the falling coal. Under socialism, men's lives and limbs will be more valuable than machinery, and science will be tasked to substitute the one for the other. In truth, the extension of machinery is very likely to solve many of the problems connected with differential advantages in employment, and it seems certain that in the very near future, the skilled worker will not be the man who is able to perform a particular set of operations, but the man who has been trained in the use of machinery. The difference of trade will be in the machine rather than in the man, whether the produce is nails or screws, boots or coats, cloth or silk, paper folding or typesetting, will depend on the internal arrangements of the mechanism and not on the method of applying the force. What we shall probably do will be to instruct all our youth in the principles of mechanics and in the handling of machines. The machines will be constructed so as to turn the force into the various channels required to produce the various articles, and the skilled workman will be the skilled mechanic, not the skilled printer or bootmaker. At the present time, a few hours or a few days' study will make the trained mechanician master of any machine you can place before him. The line of progress is to substitute machines for men in every department of production. Let the brain plan, guide, control, but let iron and steel, steam and electricity, that do not tire and cannot be brutalized, do the whole of the heavy toil that exhausts human frames today. There is not the slightest reason to suppose that we are at the end of an inventive era. Rather, are we only just beginning to grope after the uses of electricity, and machinery has before it possibilities almost undreamed of now, the man produced by our system being too rough-handed for the manipulation of delicate and complicated contrivances. I suggest this only as a probable simplification of balancing the supply and demand in various forms of labor in the future. Our immediate method of regulation must be the equalizing of advantages in them. One may guess that in each nation all the boards and communal authorities will ultimately be represented in some central executive or industrial ministry, that the Minister of Agriculture, of Mineral Industries, of Textile Industries, and so on, will have relations with similar officers in other lands, and that thus, internationally as well as nationally, cooperation will replace competition. But that end is not yet. We now approach a yet more thorny subject than the organization of the workers. What should be the remuneration of labor? What the share of the product taken respectively by the individual, the municipality, and the state? The answer depends on the answer to a previous question. Is the organization of the unemployed to be undertaken in order to transform them into self-supporting, self-respecting citizens, Or is it to be carried on as a form of exploitation, utilizing pauper labor for the production of profit for non-paupers? The whole matter turns on this point, and unless we know our own minds and fight for the right method and against the wrong from the very beginning, the organization of the unemployed will be a buttress for the present system instead of a step towards a better. Already there is talk of establishing labor colonies in connection with workhouses, and there is no time to be lost if we are to take advantage of the good in the proposal and exclude the bad. The county councils also will lead to an increase of municipal employment, and the method of that employment is vital. The ordinary vestryman, driven by the force of circumstances into organizing the unemployed, will try to extract a profit to the ratepayers from pauper farms by paying the lowest rates of wages. He would find this way of proceeding very congenial and would soon, if permitted, simply municipalize slave driving. In this way, the municipal and rural organization of labor, even when its necessity and its advantages are realized, can do nothing but change the form of exploitation of labor if the workers in public employ are to be paid a wage fixed by the competition of the market and the profits of their labor used only for the relief of the rates. Under such circumstances, we should have the whole of the rates paid by the communal workers, while the private employers would go free. This would not be a transition to socialism, but only a new way of creating a class of municipal serfs, which would make our towns burlesques of the ancient Greek slaveholding democracies. We shall find surer ground by recalling and applying the principle of socialism that the laborers shall enjoy the full product of their toil. It seems to me that this might be worked out somewhat in the following way. Out of the value of the communal produce must come rent of land payable to the local authority, rent of plant needed for working the industries, wages advanced and fixed in the usual way, taxes, reserve fund, accumulation fund, and the other charges necessary for the carrying on of the communal business. All these deducted, the remaining value should be divided among the communal workers as a bonus. It would be obviously inconvenient, if not impossible, for the district authority to subdivide this value and allot so much to each of its separate undertakings. So much left over from gas works for the men employed there, so much from the tramways for the men employed on them, and so on. It would be far simpler and easier for the municipal employees to be regarded as a single body in the service of a single employer, the local authority, and that the surplus from the whole of the businesses carried on by the communal council should be divided without distinction among the whole of the communal employees. Controversy will probably arise as to the division. Shall all the shares be equal, or shall the workers receive in proportion to the supposed dignity or indignity of the work? Inequality, however, would be odious, and I have already suggested a means of adjusting different kinds of labor to a system of equal division of net product. This meets the difficulty of the varying degrees of irksomeness without invidiously setting up any kind of socially useful labor as more honorable than any other, a distinction essentially unsocial and pernicious. But since in public affairs ethics are apt to go to the wall and appeals to social justice too often fall on deaf ears, it is lucky that in this case ethics and convenience coincide. The impossibility of estimating the separate value of each man's labor with any really valid result, the friction which would arise, the jealousies which would be provoked, the inevitable discontent, favoritism, and jobbery that would prevail, all these things will drive the communal council into the right path, equal remuneration of all workers. That path once entered on, the principle of simplification will spread, and presently it will probably be found convenient that all the communal councils shall send in their reports to a central board, stating the number of their employees, the amount of the values produced, the deductions for rent and other charges, and their available surplus. All these surpluses added together would then be divided by the total number of communal employees, and the sum thus reached would be the share of each worker. The national trusts would at first be worked separately on lines analogous to those sketched for the communes, but later these would be lumped in with the rest and so further equalize the reward of labor. As private enterprises dwindle, more and more of the workers will pass into communal employ, until at last the socialist ideal is touched of a nation in which all adults are workers and all share the national product. But be noted that all this grows out of the first organization of industry by municipalities and county councils, and will evolve just as fast or just as slowly as the community and its sections choose. The values dealt with and the numbers employed at first would not imply as much complexity of detail as is involved in many of the great businesses now carried on by individuals and by companies. The same brains will be available for the work as are now hired by individuals, and it is rather the novelty of the idea than the difficulty of its realization which will stand in the way of its acceptance. It is probable, however, that for some time to come, the captains of industry will be more highly paid than the rank and file of the industrial army, not because it is just that they should receive higher remuneration, but because they, having still the alternative of private enterprise, will be able to demand their ordinary terms, at which it will pay the community better to engage them than to do without them, which would be indeed impossible. But the remuneration will fall as education spreads. Their present value is a scarcity value, largely dependent on their monopoly of the higher education, and as the wider training is thrown open to all, an ever-increasing number will become qualified to act as organizers and directors. The form in which the worker's share is paid to him is not a matter of primary importance. It would probably be convenient to have communal banks issuing checks like those of the Czech Bank, and these banks could open credits to the workers to the amount of their remuneration. The way in which each worker expended his wealth would of course be his own business. The above method of dealing with the surplus remaining from communal labor after rent and other charges had been paid to the municipality would prove the most potent factor in the supersession of private enterprises. The amounts produced by the communal organizations would exceed those produced under individualist control. But even if this were not so, yet the shares of the communal workers, as they would include the produce now consumed by idlers, would be higher than any wage which could be paid by the private employer. Hence, competition to enter the communal service and a constant pressure on the communal councils to enlarge their undertakings. It should be added that children and workers incapacitated by age or sickness should receive an equal share with the communal employees. As all have been children, are at times sick, and hope to live to old age, all in turn would share the advantage. And it is only just that those who have labored honestly in health and through maturity should enjoy the reward of labor in sickness and through old age. The shares of individuals and of municipalities being thus apportioned, there remains only a word to say as to the Central National Council, the state par excellence. This would derive the revenues necessary for the discharge of its functions from contributions levied on the communal councils. It is evident that in the adjustment of these contributions could be effected the nationalization of any special natural resources, such as mines, harbors, etc., enjoyed by exceptionally well-situated communes. The levy would be, in fact, of the nature of an income tax. Such a plan of distribution, especially that part of it which equalizes the shares in the product, is likely to provoke the question, what will be the stimulus to labor under the proposed system? Will not the idle evade their fair share of labor and live in clover on the industry of their neighbors? The general stimulus to labor will be, in the first place, then as now, the starvation which would follow the cessation of labor. Until we discover the country in which jam rolls grow on bushes and roasted sucking pigs run about crying, "Come eat me," we are under an imperious necessity to produce. We shall work because, on the whole, we prefer work to starvation. In the transition to socialism, when the organization of labor by the communal councils begins, the performance of work will be the condition of employment. And as non-employment will mean starvation, for when work is offered, no relief of any kind need be given to the healthy adult who refuses to perform it, the strongest possible stimulus will force men to work. In fact, work or starve will be the alternative set before each communal employee, and as men now prefer long-continued and ill-paid work to starvation, they will certainly, unless human nature be entirely changed, prefer short and well-paid work to starvation. The individual shirker will be dealt with much as he is today. He will be warned, and, if he prove incorrigibly idle, discharged from the communal employ. The vast majority of men now seek to retain their employment by a reasonable discharge of their duty. Why should they not do the same when the employment is on easier conditions? At first, discharge would mean being flung back into the whirlpool of competition, a fate not likely to be challenged. Later, as the private enterprises succumbed to the competition of the commune, it would mean almost hopelessness of obtaining a livelihood. When social reorganization is complete, it would mean absolute starvation, and as this starvation would be deliberately incurred and voluntarily undergone, it would meet with no sympathy and no relief. The next stimulus would be the appetite of the worker for the result of the communal toil, and the determination of his fellow workers to make him take his fair share of the work of producing it. It is found at the present time that a very small share of the profits arising from associated labor acts as a tremendous stimulus to each individual producer. Firms which allot a part of their profits for division among their employees find the plan profitable to themselves. The men work eagerly to increase the common product, knowing that each will have a large bonus as the common product is larger. They become vigilant as to waste in production. They take care of the machinery, they save gas, etc. In a word, they lessen the cost as much as they can, because each saving means gain to them. We see from the experiments of Leclerc and Godin that inventiveness also is stimulated by a share in the common produce. The workers in these businesses are ever trying to discover better methods to improve their machinery, in a word, to progress, since each step forward brings improvement of their lot. Inventions come from a desire to save trouble, as well as from the impulse of inventive genius, the joy in accomplishing an intellectual triumph, and the delight of serving the race. Small inventions are continually being made by clever workmen to facilitate their operations, even when they are not themselves personally gainers by them, and there is no reason to fear that this spontaneous exercise of inventiveness will cease when the added productivity of labor lightens the task or increases the harvest of the laborer. Is it to be argued that men will be industrious, careful, and inventive when they get only a fraction of the result of their associated labor, but will plunge into sloth, recklessness, and stagnation when they get the whole? That a little gain stimulates, but any gain short of complete satisfaction would paralyze? If there is one vice more certain than another to be unpopular in a socialistic community, it is laziness. The man who shirked would find his mates making his position intolerable even before he suffered the doom of expulsion. But while these compelling motives will be potent in the action of man as he now is, there are others already acting on some men, which will one day act on all men. Human beings are not the simple and one-sided organisms they appear to the superficial glance of the individualist, moved only by a single motive, the desire for pecuniary gain, by one longing, the longing for wealth. Under our present social system, the struggle for riches assumes an abnormal and artificial development. Riches mean nearly all that makes life worth having: security against starvation, gratification of taste, enjoyment of pleasant and cultured society, superiority to many temptations, self-respect, consideration, comfort, knowledge, freedom, as far as these things are attainable under existing conditions. In a society where poverty means social discredit, where misfortune is treated as a crime, where the prison of the workhouse is a guerdon of failure, and the bitter carking harassment of daily wants unmet by daily supply is ever hanging over the head of each worker, what wonder that money seems the one thing needful, and that every other thought is lost in the frenzied rush to escape all that is summed up in the one word poverty. But this abnormal development of the gold hunger would disappear upon the certainty for each of the means of subsistence. Let each individual feel absolutely secure of subsistence. Let every anxiety as to the material wants of his future be swept away, and the longing for wealth will lose its leverage. The daily bread being certain, the tyranny of pecuniary gain will be broken, and life will begin to be used in living and not in struggling for the chance to live. Then will come to the front all those multifarious motives which are at work in the complex human organism even now, and which will assume their proper importance when the basis of physical life is assured: the desire to excel, the joy in creative work, the longing to improve, the eagerness to win social approval, the instinct of benevolence. All these will start into full life and will serve at once as the stimulus to labor and the reward of excellence. It is instructive to notice that these very forces may already be seen at work in every case in which subsistence is secured, and they alone supply the stimulus to action. The soldier's subsistence is certain, and does not depend on his exertions. At once he becomes susceptible to appeals to his patriotism, to his esprit de corps, to the honor of his flag. He will dare anything for glory, and value a bit of bronze, which is the reward of valor, far more than 100 times its weight in gold. Yet many of the private soldiers come from the worst of the population, and military glory and success in murder are but poor objects to aim at. If so much can be done under circumstances so unpromising, what may we not hope from nobler aspirations? Or take the eagerness, self-denial, and strenuous effort thrown by young men into their mere games. The desire to be captain of the Oxford 11, stroke of the Cambridge boat, victor in the foot race or the leaping, in a word, the desire to excel, is strong enough to impel to exertions which often ruin physical health. Everywhere we see the multiform desires of humanity assert themselves when one's livelihood is secure. It is on the devotion of these to the service of society, as the development of the social instincts teaches men to identify their interests with those of the community, that socialism must ultimately rely for progress. But in saying this, we are only saying that socialism relies for progress on human nature as a whole, instead of on that mere fragment of it known as the desire for gain. If human nature should break down, then socialism will break down, but at least we have 100 strings to our socialist bow, while the individualist has only one. But humanity will not break down. The faith which is built on it is faith founded on a rock. Under healthier and happier conditions, humanity will rise to heights undreamed of now, and the most exquisite utopias, as sung by the poet and idealist, shall to our children seem but dim and broken lies compared with their perfect day. All that we need are courage, prudence, and faith. faith above all, which dares to believe that justice and love are not impossible, and that more than the best that man can dream of shall one day be realized by man. End of section 13, read by Claudia Caldi.
Section 14 of Fabian Essays in Socialism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fabian Essays in Socialism, edited by George Bernard Shaw. Transition to Social Democracy. Transition by G. Bernard Shaw. When the British Association honored me by an invitation to take part in its proceedings, I proposed to do so by reading a paper entitled Finishing the Transition to Social Democracy. The word finishing has been, on consideration, dropped. In modern use it has gathered a certain sudden and sinister sense which I desire carefully to dissociate from the process to be described. I suggested it in the first instance only to convey in the shortest way that we are in the middle of a transition instead of shrinking from the beginning of it, and that I propose to deal with the part of it that lies before us rather than that which we have already accomplished. Therefore, though I shall begin at the beginning, I shall make no apology for traversing centuries by leaps and bounds, at the risk of sacrificing the dignity of history to the necessity for coming to the point as soon as possible. Briefly, then, let us commence by glancing at the Middle Ages. There you find, theoretically, a much more orderly England than the England of today. Agriculture is organized on an intelligible and consistent system in the feudal manor or commune. Handicraft is ordered by the guilds of the towns. Every man has his class, and every class its duties. Payments and privileges are fixed by law and custom, sanctioned by the moral sense of the community, and revised by the light of that moral sense whenever the operation of supply and demand disturbs their adjustment. Liberty and equality are unheard of, but so is free competition. The law does not suffer a laborer's wife to wear a silver girdle, neither does it force her to work 16 hours a day for the value of a modern shilling. Nobody entertains the idea that the individual has any right to trade as he pleases without reference to the rest. When the townsfolk, for instance, form a market, they quite understand that they have not taken that trouble in order to enable speculators to make money. If they catch a man buying goods solely in order to sell them a few hours later at a higher price, they treat that man as a rascal, and he never, as far as I've been able to ascertain, ventures to plead that it is socially beneficent, and indeed a pious duty, to buy in the cheapest market and sell in the dearest. If he did, they would probably burn him alive, not altogether inexcusably. As to protection, it comes naturally to them. This social order, relics of which are still to be found in all directions, did not collapse because it was unjust or absurd. It was burst by the growth of the social organism. Its machinery was too primitive and its administration too naive, too personal, too meddlesome to cope with anything more complex than a group of industrial independent communes, centralized very loosely, if at all, for purely political purposes. Industrial relations with other countries were beyond its comprehension. Its grasp of the obligations of interparochial morality was none of the surest. Of international morality it had no notion. A Frenchman or a Scotchman was a natural enemy. A Muscovite was a foreign devil. The relationship of a Negro to the human race was far more distant than that of a gorilla is now admitted to be. Thus, when the discovery of the New World began, that economic revolution which changed every manufacturing town into a mere booth of the World's Fair, and quite altered the immediate objects and views of producers, English adventurers took to the sea in a frame of mind peculiarly favorable to commercial success. They were unaffectedly pious and had the force of character which is only possible to men who are founded on convictions. At the same time, they regarded piracy as a brave and patriotic pursuit, and the slave trade as a perfectly honest branch of commerce, adventurous enough to be consistent with the honor of a gentleman, and lucrative enough to make it well worth the risk. When they stole the cargo of a foreign ship or made a heavy profit on a batch of slaves, they regarded their success as a direct proof of divine protection. The owners of accumulated wealth hastened to venture their capital with these men. Persons of all the richer degrees, from Queen Elizabeth downward, took shares in the voyages of the merchant adventurers. The returns justified their boldness, and the foundation of the industrial greatness and the industrial shame of the 18th and 19th centuries was laid. Modern capitalism thus arising in enterprises for which men are now, by civilized nations, hung or shot as human vermin. And it is curious to see still, in the commercial adventurers of our own time, the same incongruous combination of piety and rectitude with the most unscrupulous and revolting villainy. We all know the merchant princes whose enterprise, whose steady perseverance, whose high personal honor, blameless family relations, large charities, and liberal endowment of public institutions mark them as very pillars of society, and who are nevertheless grinding their wealth out of the labor of women and children with such murderous rapacity that they have to hand over the poorest of their victims to sweaters, whose sole special function is the evasion of the factory acts. They have, in fact, no more sense of social solidarity with the wage workers than Drake had with the Spaniards or Negroes. With the rise of foreign trade and capitalism, industry so far outgrew the control, not merely of the individual, but of the village, the guild, the municipality, and even the central government, that it seemed as if all attempt at regulation must be abandoned. Every law made for the better ordering of business either did not work at all, or worked only as a monopoly enforced by exasperating official meddling, directly injuring the general interest and reacting disastrously on the particular interest it was intended to protect. The laws, too, had ceased to be even honestly intended, owing to the seizure of political power by the capitalist classes, which had been prodigiously enriched by the operation of economic laws which were not then understood. Matters reached a position in which legislation and regulation were so mischievous and corrupt that anarchy became the ideal of all progressive thinkers and practical men. The intellectual revolt formally inaugurated by the Reformation was reinforced in the 18th century by the great industrial revolution, which began with the utilization of steam and the invention of the spinning jenny. Then came chaos. The feudal system became an absurdity when its basis of communism with inequality of condition had changed into private property with free contract and competition rents. The guild system had no machinery for dealing with division of labor, the factory system, or international trade. It recognized in competitive individualism only something to be repressed as diabolical. But competitive individualism simply took possession of the guilds and turned them into refectories for aldermen, and notable additions to the grievances and laughingstocks of posterity. The desperate effort of the human intellect to unravel this tangle of industrial anarchy brought modern political economy into existence. It took shape in France, where the confusion was thrice confounded, and proved itself a more practical department of philosophy than the metaphysics of the schoolmen, the utopian socialism of More, or the sociology of Hobbes. It could trace its ancestry to Aristotle, but just then the human intellect was rather tired of Aristotle, whose economics, besides, were those of slave-holding republics. Political economy soon declared for industrial anarchy, for private property, for individual recklessness of everything except individual accumulation of riches, and for the abolition of all the functions of the state except those of putting down violent conduct and invasions of private property. It might have echoed Jack Cade's exclamation, "But then are we in order when we are most out of order?" Although this was what political economy decreed, it must not be inferred that the greater economists were any more advocates of mere license than Prince Kropotkin or Mr. Herbert Spencer or Mr. Benjamin Tucker of Boston, or any other modern anarchist. They did not admit that the alternative to state regulation was anarchy. They held that nature had provided an all-powerful automatic regulator in competition, and that by its operation self-interest would evolve order out of chaos if only it were allowed its own way. They love to believe that a right and just social order is not an artificial and painfully maintained legal edifice, but a spontaneous outcome of the free play of the forces of nature. They were reactionaries against feudal domineering and medieval meddling and ecclesiastical intolerance, and they were able to show how all three had ended in disgraceful failure, corruption, and self-stultification. Indignant at the spectacle of the peasants struggling against the denial of those rights of private property which his feudal lord had successfully usurped, they strenuously affirmed the right of private property for all. And whilst they were dazzled by the prodigious impulse given to production by the Industrial Revolution under competitive private enterprise, they were at the same time, for want of statistics, so optimistically ignorant of the condition of the masses that we find David Hume in 1766 writing to Turgot that no man is so industrious but he may add some hours more in the week to his labor, and scarce anyone is so poor but he can retrench something of his expense. No student ever gathers from a study of the individualist economists that the English proletariat was seething in horror and degradation, whilst the riches of the proprietors were increasing by leaps and bounds. The historical ignorance of the economists did not, however, disable them from the abstract work of scientific political economy. All their most cherished institutions and doctrines succumbed one by one to their analysis of the laws of production and exchange. With one law alone, the law of rent, they destroyed the whole series of assumptions upon which private property is based. The a priorist notion that among free competitors wealth must go to the industrious, and poverty be the just and natural punishment of the lazy and improvident, proved as illusory as the apparent flatness of the earth. Here was a vast mass of wealth, called economic rent, increasing with the population, and consisting of the difference between the product of the national industry as it actually was, and as it would have been if every acre of land in the country had been no more fertile or favorably situated than the very worst acre from which a bare living could be extracted. All quite incapable of being assigned to this or that individual or class as the return to his or its separate exertions. All purely social or commonwealth, for the private appropriation of which no permanently valid and intellectually honest excuse could be made. Ricardo is quite as explicit and far more thorough on the subject than Mr. Henry George. He pointed out, I quote his own words, that the whole surplus produce of the soil, after deducting from it only such moderate profits as are sufficient to encourage accumulation, must finally rest with the landlord. It was only by adopting a preposterous theory of value that Ricardo was able to maintain that the laborer, selling himself for wages to the proprietor, would always command his cost of production, i.e., his daily subsistence. Even that slender consolation vanished later on before the renewed investigation of value made by Jevons, who demonstrated that the value of a commodity is a function of the quantity available and may fall to zero when the supply outruns the demand so far as to make the final increment of the supply useless, a fact which the unemployed had discovered without the aid of the differential calculus before Jevons was born. Private property, in fact, left no room for newcomers. Malthus pointed this out and urged that there should be no newcomers, that the population should remain stationary. But the population took exactly as much notice of this modest demand for stagnation as the incoming tide took of King Canute's ankles. Indeed, the demand was the less reasonable, since the power of production per head was increasing faster than the population, as it still is, the increase of poverty being produced simply by the increase and private appropriation of rent. After Ricardo had completed the individualist synthesis of production and exchange, a dialectical war broke out. Proudhon had only to skim through a Ricardian treatise to understand just enough of it to be able to show that political economy was a reductio ad absurdum of private property instead of a justification of it. Ferdinand Lassalle, with Ricardo in one hand and Hegel in the other, turned all the heavy guns of the philosophers and economists on private property with such effect that no one dared to challenge his characteristic boasts of the irresistible equipment of social democracy in point of culture. Karl Marx, without even giving up the Ricardian value theory, seized on the blue books which contain the true history of the leaps and bounds of England's prosperity and convicted private property of wholesale spoliation, murder, and compulsory prostitution, of plague, pestilence, and famine, battle, murder, and sudden death. This was hardly what had been expected from an institution so highly spoken of. Many critics said that the attack was not fair. No one ventured to pretend that the charges were not true. The facts were not only admitted, they had been legislated upon. Social democracy was working itself out practically as well as academically. Before I recite the steps of the transition, I will, as a matter of form, explain what social democracy is, though doubtless nearly all my hearers are already conversant with it. What the achievement of socialism involves economically is a transfer of rent from the class which now appropriates it to the whole people. Rent being that part of the produce which is individually unearned, this is the only equitable method of disposing of it. There is no means of getting rid of economic rent, so long as the fertility of land varies from acre to acre, and the number of persons passing by a shop window per hour varies from street to street, with the result that two farmers or two shopkeepers of exactly equal intelligence and industry will reap unequal returns from their year's work, so long will it be equitable to take from the richer farmer or shopkeeper the excess over his fellow's gain, which he owes to the bounty of nature or the advantage of situation, and divide that excess of rent equally between the two. If the pair of farms or shops be left in the hands of a private landlord, he will take the excess, and instead of dividing it between his two tenants, live on it himself idly at their expense. The economic object of socialism is not, of course, to equalize farmers and shopkeepers in couples, but to carry out their principle over the whole community by collecting all rents and throwing them into the national treasury. As the private proprietor has no reason for clinging to his property except the legal power to take the rent and spend it on himself, this legal power being in fact what really constitutes him a proprietor, its abrogation would mean its expropriation. The socialization of rent would mean the socialization of the sources of production by the expropriation of the present private proprietors and the transfer of their property to the entire nation. This transfer, then, is the subject matter of the transition to socialism, which began some 45 years ago, as far as any phase of social evolution can be said to begin at all. It will be at once seen that the valid objections to socialism consist wholly of practical difficulties. On the ground of abstract justice, socialism is not only unobjectionable, but sacredly imperative. I am afraid that in the ordinary middle-class opinion, socialism is flagrantly dishonest, but could be established offhand tomorrow with the help of a guillotine if there were no police and the people were wicked enough. In truth, it is as honest as it is inevitable, but all the mobs and guillotines in the world can no more establish it than police coercion can avert it. The first practical difficulty is raised by the idea of the entire people collectively owning land, capital, or anything else. Here is the rent arising out of the people's industry. Here are the pockets of the private proprietors. The problem is to drop that rent not into those private pockets, but into the people's pocket. Yes, but where is the people's pocket? Who is the people? What is the people? Tom we know, and Dick, also Harry, but solely and separately as individuals. As a trinity they have no existence. who is their trustee, their guardian, their man of business, their manager, their secretary, even their stakeholder. The socialist is stopped dead at the threshold of practical actions by this difficulty until he bethinks himself of the state as the representative and trustee of the people. Now, if you will just form a hasty picture of the governments which called themselves states in Ricardo's day, consisting of rich proprietors legislating either by divine right or by the exclusive suffrage of the poorer proprietors, and filling the executives with the creatures of their patronage and favoritism, if you look beneath their oratorical parliamentary discussions, conducted with all the splendor and decorum of an expensive sham fight, if you consider their class interests, their shameless corruption, and the waste and mismanagement which disgraced all their bungling attempts at practical business of any kind, you will understand why Ricardo, clearly as he saw the economic consequences of private appropriation of rent, never dreamt of state appropriation as a possible alternative. The socialist of that time did not greatly care. He was only a benevolent utopian who planned model communities and occasionally carried them out with negatively instructive and positively disastrous results. When his successors learned economics from Ricardo, they saw the difficulty quite as plainly as Ricardo's vulgarizers. The Whig doctrinaires who accepted the incompetence and corruption of states as permanent inherent state qualities, like the acidity of lemons. Not that the socialists were not doctrinaires too, but outside economics they were pupils of Hegel, whilst the Whigs were pupils of Bentham and Austin. Bentham's was not the school in which men learned to solve problems to which history alone could give the key, or to form conceptions which belonged to the evolutional order. Hegel, on the other hand, expressly taught the conception of the perfect state, and his pupils saw that nothing in the nature of things made it impossible, or even specifically difficult, to make the existing state, if not absolutely perfect, at least practically trustworthy. They contemplated the insolent and inefficient government official of their day without rushing to the conclusion that the state uniform had a magic property of extinguishing all business capacity, integrity, and common civility in the wearer. When state officials obtained their posts by favoritism and patronage, efficiency on their part was an accident, and politeness a condescension. When they retained their posts without any effective responsibility to the public, they naturally defrauded the public by making their posts sinecures, and insulted the public when, by personal inquiry, it made itself troublesome. But every successfully conducted private business establishment in the kingdom was an example of the ease with which public ones could be reformed as soon as there was the effective will to find out the way. Make the passing of a sufficient examination an indispensable preliminary to entering the executive. Make the executive responsible to the government and the government responsible to the people. And state departments will be provided with all the guarantees for integrity and efficiency that private money hunting pretends to. Thus the old bugbear of state imbecility did not terrify the socialist. It only made him a Democrat. But to call himself so simply would have had the effect of classing him with the ordinary destructive politician who is a Democrat without ulterior views for the sake of formal democracy, one whose notion of radicalism is the pulling up of aristocratic institutions by the roots, who is, briefly, a sort of universal abolitionist. Consequently, we have the distinctive term social democrat, indicating the man or woman who desires through democracy to gather the whole people into the state so that the state may be trusted with the rent of the country, and finally with the land, the capital, and the organization of the national industry, with all the sources of production, in short, which are now abandoned to the cupidity of irresponsible private individuals. The benefits of such a change as this are so obvious to all except the existing private proprietors and their parasites that it is very necessary to insist on the impossibility of effecting it suddenly. The young socialist is apt to be catastrophic in his views, to plan the revolutionary program as an affair of 24 lively hours, With individualism in full swing on Monday morning, a tidal wave of the insurgent proletariat on Monday afternoon, and socialism in complete working order on Tuesday. A man who believes that such a happy dispatch is possible will naturally think it absurd and even inhumane to stick at bloodshed in bringing it about. He can prove that the continuance of the present system for a year costs more suffering than could be crammed into any Monday afternoon, however sanguinary. This is a phase of conviction in which are delivered those socialist speeches which make what the newspaper call good copy, and which are the only ones they as yet report. Such speeches are encouraged by the hasty opposition they evoke from thoughtless persons, who begin by tacitly admitting that a sudden change is feasible, and go on to protest that it would be wicked. The experienced social democrat converts his too ardent follower by first admitting that if the change could be made catastrophically, it would be well worth making, and then proceeding to point out that it would involve a readjustment of productive industry to meet the demand created by an entirely new distribution of purchasing power. It would also involve, in the application of labor and industrial machinery, alterations which no afternoon's work could effect. You cannot convince any man that it is impossible to tear down a government in a day, but everybody is convinced already that you cannot convert first and third class carriages into second class, rookeries and palaces into comfortable dwellings, and jewelers and dressmakers into bakers and builders by merely singing the Marseillaise. No judicious person, however deeply persuaded that the work of the court dressmaker has no true social utility, would greatly care to quarter her idly on the genuinely productive workers, pending the preparation of a place for her in their ranks. For though she is to all intents and purposes quartered on them at present, yet she at least escapes the demoralization of idleness. Until her new place is ready, it is better that her patrons should find dressmaking for her hands to do than that Satan should find mischief. Demolishing a Bastille with 7 prisoners in it is one thing. Demolishing one with 14 million prisoners is quite another. I need not enlarge on the point. The necessity for a cautious and gradual change must be obvious to everyone here, and could be made obvious to everyone elsewhere if only the catastrophists were courageously and sensibly dealt with in discussion. What then does a gradual transition to social democracy mean specifically? It means a gradual extension of the franchise and the transfer of rent and interest to the state, not in one lump sum, but by installments. Looked at in this way, it will at once be seen that we are already far on the road and are being urged further by many politicians who do not dream that they are touched with socialism, nay, who would earnestly repudiate the touch as a taint. Let us see how far we have gone. In 1832, the political power passed into the hands of the middle class, and in 1838, Lord John Russell announced finality. Meanwhile, in 1834, the middle class had swept away the last economic refuge of the workers, the old poor law, and delivered them naked to the furies of competition. Footnote 79. The general impression that the old poor law had become an indefensible nuisance is a correct one. All attempts to mitigate individualism by philanthropy instead of replacing it by socialism are foredoomed to confusion. 10 years' turmoil and active emigration followed, and then the thin end of the wedge went in. The income tax was established, and the factory acts were made effective. The income tax, 1842, which is on individualist principles an intolerable spoliative anomaly, is simply a forcible transfer of rent, interest, and even rent of ability from private holders to the state without compensation. It excuses itself to the Whigs on the ground that those who had the most property for the state to protect should pay off ad valorem for its protection. The Factory Act swept the anarchic theory of the irresponsibility of private enterprise out of practical politics, made employers accountable to the state for the well-being of their employees, and transferred a further installment of profits directly to the worker by raising wages. Then came the gold discoveries in California, 1847, and Australia, 1851, and the period of leaps and bounds supported by the economic rent of England's mineral fertility, which kindled Mr. Gladstone's retrogressive instincts to a vain hope of abolishing the income tax. These events relieved the pressure set up by the new Poor Law. The workers rapidly organized themselves in trades unions, which were denounced then for their tendency to sap the manly independence which had formerly characterized the British workman, and which are today held up to him as the self-helpful perfection of that manly independence. Howbeit, self-help flourished, especially at Manchester and Sheffield. State help was voted grandmotherly, wages went up, and the unions, like the fly on the wheel, thought that they had raised them. They were mistaken, but the value of trade unionism in awakening the social conscience of the skilled workers was immense, though to this there was a heavy set-off in its tendency to destroy their artistic conscience by making them aware that it was their duty to one another to discourage rapid and efficient workmanship by every means in their power. An extension of the franchise, which was really an installment of democracy, and not, like the 1832 Reform Bill, only an advance towards it, was gained in 1867, and immediately afterwards came another installment of socialism in the shape of a further transfer of rent and interest from private holders to the state for the purpose of educating the people. In the meantime, the extraordinary success of the post office, which according to the teaching of the Manchester School should have been a nest of incompetence and jobbery, had not only shown the perfect efficiency of state enterprise when the officials are made responsible to the class interested in its success, but had also proved the enormous convenience and cheapness of socialistic or collectivist charges over those of private enterprise. For example, the Postmaster General charges a penny for sending a letter weighing an ounce from Kensington to Bayswater. Private enterprise would send half a pound the same distance for a farthing and make a handsome profit on it. But the Postmaster General also sends an ounce letter from Land's End to John O. Groat's house for a penny. Private enterprise would probably demand at least a shilling, if not 5, for such a service, and there are many places in which private enterprise would not on any terms maintain a post office. Therefore, a citizen with 10 letters to post saves considerably by the uniform socialistic charge and quite recognizes the necessity for rigidly protecting their postmaster's monopoly. After 1875, leaping and bounding prosperity, after a final spurt during which the income tax fell to 2 pence, got out of breath and has not yet recovered it. Russia and America, among other competitors, began to raise the margin of cultivation at a surprising rate. Education began to intensify the sense of suffering and to throw light upon its causes in dark places. The capital needed to keep English industry abreast of the growing population began to be attracted by the leaping and bounding of foreign loans and investments, and to bring to England, in payment of interest, imports that were not paid for by exports, a phenomenon inexpressibly disconcerting to the Cobden Club. The old pressure of the 1830s came back again, and presently, as if Chartism and Fergus O'Connor had risen from the dead, the Democratic Federation and Mr. H.M. Hyndman appeared in the field, highly significant as signs of the times, and looming hideously magnified in the guilty eye of property, if not of great account as direct factors in the course of events. Numbers of young men, pupils of Mill, Spencer, Comte, and Darwin, roused by Mr. Henry George's Progress and Poverty, left aside evolution and free thought, took to insurrectionary economics, studied Karl Marx, and were so convinced that socialism had only to be put clearly before the working classes to concentrate the power of their immense numbers in one irresistible organization, that the revolution was fixed for 1889, the anniversary of the French Revolution at latest. I remember being asked satirically and publicly at that time how long I thought it would take to get socialism into working order if I had my way. I replied with a spirited modesty that a fortnight would be ample for the purpose. When I add that I was frequently complimented on being one of the more reasonable socialists, you will be able to appreciate the fervor of our conviction and the extravagant levity of our practical ideas. The opposition we got was uninstructive. It was mainly founded on the assumption that our projects were theoretically unsound, but immediately possible, whereas our weak point lay in the case being exactly the reverse. However, the ensuing years sifted and sobered us. The socialists, as they were called, have fallen into line as a social democratic party, no more insurrectionary in its policy than any other party. But I shall not present the remainder of the transition to social democracy as the work of fully conscious social democrats. I prefer to ignore them altogether, to suppose, if you will, that the government will shortly follow the advice of the Saturday Review and, for the sake of peace and quietness, hang them. End of section 14, read by Brize Cries, Youngstown. Section 15 of Fabian Essays in Socialism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fabian Essays in Socialism, edited by George Bernard Shaw. The transition to social democracy, transition continued. First then, as to the consummation of democracy. Since 1885, every man who pays 4 shillings a week rent can only be hindered from voting by anomalous conditions of registration which are likely to be swept away very shortly. This is all but manhood suffrage, and it will soon complete itself as adult suffrage. However, I may leave adult suffrage out of the question because the outlawry of women, monstrous as it is not a question of class privilege but of sex privilege. To complete the foundation of this democratic state, then, we need manhood suffrage, abolition of all poverty disqualifications, abolition of the House of Lords, public payment of candidates' expenses, public payment of representatives, and annual elections. These changes are now inevitable, however unacceptable they may appear to those of us who are conservatives. They have been for half a century the commonplaces of radicalism. We have next to consider that the state is not merely an abstraction, it is a machine to do certain work, and if that work be increased and altered in its character, the machinery must be multiplied and altered too. Now the extension of the franchise does increase and alter the work very considerably, but it has no direct effect on the machinery. At present, the state machine has practically broken down under the strain of spreading democracy, the work being mainly local and the machinery mainly central. Without efficient local machinery, the replacing of private enterprise by state enterprise is out of the question, and we shall presently see that such replacement is one of the inevitable consequences of democracy. A democratic state cannot become a social democratic state unless it has in every center of population a local governing body as thoroughly democratic in its constitution as the central parliament. This matters also well in train. In 1888, a government avowedly reactionary passed a local government bill which effected a distinct advance towards the democratic municipality. Footnote 83. This same government, beginning to realize what it has unintentionally done for social democracy, is already, 1889, doing what it can to render the new county councils socialistically impotent by urgently reminding them of the restrictions which hamper their action. It was furthermore a bill with no single aspect of finality anywhere about it. Local self-government remains prominent within the sphere of practical politics. When it is achieved, the democratic state will have the machinery for socialism. And now, how is the raw material of socialism, otherwise the proletarian man, to be brought to the democratic state machinery? Here again the path is easily found. Politicians who have no suspicion that they are socialists are advocating further installments of socialism with a recklessness of indirect results which scandalizes a conscious social democrat. The phenomenon of economic rent has assumed prodigious proportions in our great cities. The injustice of its private appropriation is glaring, flagrant, almost ridiculous. In the long suburban roads about London, where rows of exactly similar houses stretch for miles countrywards, the rent changes at every few thousand yards by exactly the amount saved or incurred annually in traveling to and from the householder's place of business. The seeker after lodgings, hesitating between Bloomsbury and Tottenham, finds every advantage of situation skimmed off by the landlord with scientific precision. As lease after lease falls in, houses, shops, goodwills of businesses, which are the fruits of the labor of lifetimes, fall into the maw of the ground landlord. Confiscation of capital, spoliation of households, annihilation of incentive, everything that the most ignorant and credulous fundholder ever charged against the socialist, rages openly in London, which begins to ask itself whether it exists and toils only for the typical duke and his celebrated jockey and his famous racehorse. Lord Hobhouse and his unimpeachably respectable committee for the taxation of ground values are already in the field, claiming the value of the site of London for London collectively, and their agitation receives additional momentum from every lease that falls in. Their case is unassailable, and the evil they attack is one that presses on the rate-paying and leaseholding classes, as well as upon humbler sufferers. This economic pressure is reinforced formidably by political opinion in the workmen's associations. Here the moderate members are content to demand a progressive income tax, which is virtually Lord Hobhouse's proposal, and the extremists are all for land nationalization, which is again Lord Hobhouse's principle. The cry for such taxation cannot permanently be resisted, and it is very worthy of remark that there is a new note in the cry. Formerly taxes were proposed for a specific object, to pay for a war, for education, or the like. Now the proposal is to tax the landlords in order to get some of our money back from them, take it from them first and find a use for it afterwards. Ever since Mr. Henry George's book reached the English radicals, there has been a growing disposition to impose a tax of 20 shillings in the pound on obviously unearned incomes, that is, to dump 450 millions a year down on the exchequer counter and then retire with 3 cheers for the restoration of the land to the people. The results of such a proceeding, if it actually came off, would considerably take its advocates aback. The streets would presently be filled with starving workers of all grades, domestic servants, coach builders, decorators, jewelers, lace makers, fashionable professional men, and numberless others whose livelihood is at present gained by ministering to the wants of these and of the proprietary class. This, they would cry, is what your theories have brought us to. Back with the good old times when we received our wages, which were at least better than nothing. Evidently the Chancellor of the Exchequer would have 3 courses open to him. 1, he would give the money back again to the landlords and capitalists with an apology. 2, he could attempt to start state industries with it for the employment of the people. 3, or he could simply distribute it among the unemployed. The last is not to be thought of. Anything is better than panem et circenses. The second, starting state industries, would be far too vast an undertaking to get on foot soon enough to meet the urgent difficulty. The first, the return with an apology, would be a reductio ad absurdum of the whole affair, a confession that the private proprietor, for all his idleness and his voracity, is indeed performing an indispensable economic function, the function of capitalizing, however wastefully and viciously, the wealth which surpasses his necessarily limited power of immediate personal consumption. And here we have checkmate to mere Henry Georgeism, or state appropriation of rent without socialism. It is easy to show that the state is entitled to the whole income of the Duke of Westminster, and to argue therefrom that he should straightway be taxed 20 shillings on the pound. But in practical earnest, the state has no right to take 5 farthings of capital from the Duke or anybody else until it is ready to invest them in productive enterprise. The consequences of withdrawing capital from private hands merely to lock it up unproductively in the Treasury would be so swift and ruinous that no statesman, however fortified with the destructive resources of abstract economics, could persist in it. It will be found in the future, as in the past, that governments will raise money only because they want it for specific purposes, and not on a priori demonstrations that they have a right to it. But it must be added that when they do want it for a specific purpose, then also in the future, as in the past, they will raise it without the slightest regard to a priori demonstrations that they have no right to it. Here then we have got to a deadlock. In spite of Democrats and land nationalizers, rent cannot be touched unless some pressure from quite another quarter forces productive enterprise on the state. Such pressure is already forthcoming. The quick starvation of the unemployed, the slow starvation of the employed who have no relatively scarce special skill, the unbearable anxiety or dangerous recklessness of those who are employed today and unemployed tomorrow, the rise in urban rents, the screwing down of wages by pauper immigration and home multiplication, the hand-in-hand advance of education and discontent, and all working up to explosion point. It is useless to prove by statistics that most of the people are better off than before, true as that probably is, thanks to installments of social democracy. Yet even that is questionable, for it is idle to claim authority for statistics of things that have never been recorded. Chaos has no statistics. It has only statisticians, and the ablest of them prefaces his remarks on the increased consumption of rice by the admission that no one can contemplate the present condition of the masses without desiring something like a revolution for the better. The masses themselves are being converted so rapidly to that view of the situation that we have pan-Anglican synods, bewildered by a revival of Christianity, pleading that though socialism is eminently Christian, yet the church must act safely as well as sublimely. During the agitation made by the unemployed last winter, 1887 to 1888, the Chief Commissioner of Police in London started at his own shadow and mistook Mr. John Burns for the French Revolution, to the great delight of that genial and courageous champion of his class. The existence of the pressure is further shown by the number and variety of safety valves proposed to relieve it: monetization of silver, import duties, leaseholds, enfranchisement, extension of joint stock capitalism masquerading as cooperation. Footnote 88. It is due to the leaders of the cooperative movement to say here that they are no parties to the substitution of dividend hunting by petty capitalists for the pursuit of the ideal of Robert Owen, the socialist founder of cooperation, and that they are fully aware that cooperation must be a political as well as a commercial movement if it is to achieve a final solution to the labor question. And other irrelevancies. My own sudden promotion from the street corner to this platform is in its way a sign of the times. But whilst we are pointing the moral and adorning the tale according to our various opinions, an actual struggle is beginning between the unemployed who demand work and the local authorities appointed to deal with the poor. In the winter, the unemployed collect round red flags and listen to speeches for want of anything else to do. They welcome socialism, insurrectionism, currency craze, anything that passes the time and seems to express the fact that they are hungry. The local authorities, equally innocent of studied economic views, deny that there is any misery, send leaders of deputations to the local government board, who promptly send them back to the guardians, try bullying, try stone yards, try bludgeoning, and finally sit down helplessly and wish it were summer again, or the unemployed at the bottom of the sea. Meanwhile, the charity fund, which is much less elastic than the wages fund, overflows at the mansion house only to run dry at the permanent institutions. So unstable a state of things cannot last. The bludgeoning and the shocking clamor for bloodshed from the anti-popular newspapers will create a revulsion among the humane section of the middle class, the section which is blinded by class prejudice to all sense of social responsibility, dreads personal violence from the working class with a superstitious terror that defies enlightenment or control. Municipal employment must be offered at last. This cannot be done in one place alone. The rush from other parts of the country would swamp an isolated experiment. Wherever the pressure is, the relief must be given on the spot. And since public decency, as well as consideration for its higher officials, will prevent the county council from instituting a working day of 16 hours at a wage of a penny an hour or less, it will soon have on its hands not only the unemployed, but also the white slaves of the sweater, who will escape from their dens and appeal to the municipality for work the moment they become aware that municipal employment is better than private sweating. Nay, the sweater himself, a mere slave driver paid by the piece, will in many instances be as anxious as his victims to escape from his hideous trade. But the municipal organization of the industry of these people will require capital. Where is the municipality to get it? Raising the rates is out of the question. The ordinary tradesmen and householders are already rated and rented to the limit of endurance. Further burdens would almost bring them into the street with a red flag. Dreadful dilemma, in which the county council, between the devil and the deep sea, will hear Lord Hobhouse singing a song of deliverance, telling a golden tale of ground values to be municipalized by taxation. The land nationalizers will swell the chorus, the radical progressive income taxers singing together, and the rate-paying tenants shouting for joy. The capital difficulty thus solved, for we need not seriously anticipate that the landlords will actually fight, as our president once threatened. The question of acquiring land will arise. The nationalizers will declare for its annexation by the municipality without compensation, but that will be rejected as spoliation, worthy only of revolutionary socialists. The no compensation cry is indeed a piece of unpractical, catastrophic insurrectionism, for whilst compensations would be unnecessary and absurd if every proprietor were expropriated simultaneously, and the proprietary system at once replaced by full-blown socialism, yet when it is necessary to proceed by degrees, the denial of compensation would have the effect of singling out individual proprietors for expropriation, whilst the others remained unmolested, and depriving them of their private means long before there was suitable municipal employment ready for them. The land, as it is required, will therefore be honestly purchased, and the purchase money, or the interest thereon, will be procured, like the capital, by taxing rent. Of course, this will be at bottom an act of expropriation just as much as the collection of income tax today is an act of expropriation. As such, it will be denounced by the landlords as merely a committing of the newest sin the oldest kind of way. In effect, they will be compelled at each purchase to buy out one of their body and present his land to the municipality, thereby distributing the loss fairly over the whole class, instead of placing it on one man who is no more responsible than the rest. But they will be compelled to do this in a manner that will satisfy the moral sense of the ordinary citizen as effectively as that of the skilled economist. We now foresee our municipality equipped with land and capital for industrial purposes. At first, they will naturally extend the industries they already carry on, road making, gasworks, tramways, building, and the like. It is probable that they will for the most part regard their action as a mere device to meet a passing emergency. The Manchester School will urge its protectionist theories as to the exemption of private enterprise from the competition of public enterprise in one supreme effort to practice for the last time on popular ignorance of the science which it has consistently striven to debase and stultify. For a while, the proprietary party will succeed in hampering and restricting municipal enterprise. In attaching the stigma of pauperism to its service, in keeping the lot of its laborers as nearly as possible down to private competition level in point of hard work and low wages, but its power will be broken by the disappearance of that general necessity for keeping down the rates which now hardens local authority to humane appeals. The luxury of being generous at someone else's expense will be irresistible. The ground landlord will be the municipal milk cow, and the ordinary ratepayers will feel the advantage of sleeping in peace, relieved at once from the fear of increased burdens and of having their windows broken and their premises looted by hungry mobs, nuclei of all the socialism and scoundrelism of the city. They will have just as much remorse in making the landlord pay as the landlord has had in making them pay, just as much and no more. And as a municipality becomes more democratic, it will find landlordism losing power, not only relatively to democracy, but absolutely. The ordinary ratepayer, however, will not remain unaffected for long. At the very outset of the new extension of municipal industries, the question of wage will arise. A minimum wage must be fixed, and though at first, to avoid an overwhelming rush of applicants for employment, it must be made too small to tempt any decently employed laborer to forsake his place and run to the municipality, still it will not be the frankly infernal competition wage. It will be, like medieval wages, fixed with at least some reference to public opinion as to a becoming standard of comfort. Over and above this, the municipality will have to pay to its organizers, managers, and incidentally necessary skilled workers the full market price of their ability, minus only what the superior prestige and permanence of public employment may induce them to accept. But whilst these high salaries will make no more disturbance in the labor market than the establishment of a new joint stock company would, the minimum wage for laborers will affect the market perceptibly. The worst sort of sweaters will find that if they are to keep their hands, they must treat them at least as well as the municipality. The consequent advance in wage will swallow up the sweater's narrow margin of profit. Hence the sweater must raise the price per piece against the shops and wholesale houses for which he sweats. This again will diminish the profits of the wholesale dealers and shopkeepers, who will not be able to recover this loss by raising the price of their wares against the public, since, had any such step been possible, they would have taken it before. But fortunately for them, the market value of their ability as men of business is fixed by the same laws that govern the price of commodities. Just as a sweater is worth his profit, so they are worth their profit, and just as a sweater will be able to extract from them his old remuneration, in spite of the advance in wages, so they will be able to extract their old remuneration in spite of the advance in sweaters' terms. But from whom, it will be asked, if not from the public by raising the price of their wares? Evidently from the landlord upon whose land they are organizing production. In other words, they will demand and obtain a reduction of rent. Thus the organizer of industry, the employer, pure and simple, the entrepreneur, as he is often called in economic treatises nowadays, will not suffer. In the division of the product, his share will remain constant, whilst the industrious wage worker's share will be increased and the idle proprietor's share diminished. This will not adjust itself without friction and clamor, but such friction is constantly going on under the present system in the opposite direction, i.e. by the raising of the proprietor's share at the expense of the workers. The contraction of landlords' incomes will necessarily diminish the revenue from taxation on such incomes. Let us suppose that the municipality, to maintain its revenue, puts on an additional penny in the pound. The effect will be to burn the landlord's candle at both ends, obviously not a process that can be continued to infinity. But long before taxation fails as a source of municipal capital, the municipalities will have begun to save capital out of the product of their own industries. In the market, the competition of those industries with the private concerns will be irresistible. Unsaddled with a single idle person, and having therefore nothing to provide for after paying their employees, except extension of capital, They will be able to offer wages that no business burdened with the unproductive consumption of an idle landlord or shareholder could afford, unless it yielded a heavy rent in consequence of some marked advantage of site. But even rents, when they are town rents, are at the mercy of a municipality in the long run. The masters of the streets and the traffic can nurse one site and neglect another. The rent of a shop depends on the number of persons passing its windows per hour. A skillfully timed series of experiments in paving, a new bridge, a tramway service, a barracks, or a smallpox hospital are only a few of the circumstances of which city rents are the creatures. The power of the municipality to control these circumstances is as obvious as the impotence of competing private individuals. Again, competing private individuals are compelled to sell their produce at a price equivalent to the full cost of production at the margin of cultivation. The municipality could compete against them by reducing prices to the average cost of production over the whole area of municipal cultivation. The more favorably situated private concerns could only meet this by ceasing to pay rent. The less favorably situated would succumb without remedy. It would be either stalemate or checkmate. Private property would either become barren, or it would yield to the actual cultivator of average ability no better an income than could be obtained more securely in municipal employment. To the mere proprietor it would yield nothing. Eventually the land and industry of the whole town would pass by the spontaneous action of economic forces into the hands of the municipality, and so far the problem of socializing industry would be solved. Private property, by cheapening the laborer to the utmost in order to get the greater surplus out of him, lowers the margin of human cultivation, and so raises the rent of ability. The most important form of that rent is the profit of industrial management. The gains of a great portrait painter or fashionable physician are much less significant, since these depend entirely on the existence of a very rich class of patrons subject to acute vanity and hypochondriasis. But the industrial organizer is dependent of patrons. Instead of merely attracting a larger share of the product of industry to himself, he increases the product by his management. The market price of such ability depends upon the relation of the supply to the demand. The more there is of it, the cheaper it is, the less the dearer. Any cause that increases the supply lowers the price. Now it is evident that since a manager must be a man of education and address, it is useless to look ordinarily to the laboring class for a supply of managerial skill. Not one laborer in a million succeeds in raising himself on the shoulders of his fellows by extraordinary gifts or extraordinary luck, or both. The managers must be drawn from the classes which enjoy education and social culture, and their price, rapidly as it is falling with the spread of education and the consequent growth of the intellectual proletariat, is still high. It is true that a very able and highly trained manager can now be obtained for about £800 a year, provided his post does not compel him to spend 2/3 of his income on what is called keeping up his position, instead of on his own gratification. Still, when it is considered that laborers receive less than £50 a year, and that the demand for laborers is necessarily vast in proportion to the demand for able managers, nay, that there is an inverse ratio between them, since the manager's talent is valuable in proportion to a quantity of labor he can organize, it will be admitted that £800 a year represents an immense rent of ability. But if the education and culture, which are a practically indispensable part of the equipment of competitors for such posts, were enjoyed by millions instead of thousands, that rent would fall considerably. Now the tendency of private property is to keep the masses mere beasts of burden. The tendency of social democracy is to educate them, to make men of them. Social democracy would not long be saddled with the rents of ability, which have during the last century made our born captains of industry our masters and tyrants, instead of our servants and leaders. It is even conceivable that rent of managerial skill might in course of time become negative. Footnote 94. That is, the manager would receive less for his work than the artisan. Cases in which the profits of the employer are smaller than the wages of the employee are by no means uncommon in certain grades of industry where small traders have occasion to employ skilled workmen. Astonishing as that may seem to the many persons who are by this time so hopelessly confused amid existing anomalies that the proposition that whosoever of you will be the chiefest shall be the servant of all strikes them rather as a utopian paradox than as the most obvious and inevitable of social arrangements. The fall in the rent of ability will, however, benefit not only the municipality, but also its remaining private competitors. Nevertheless, as the prestige of the municipality grows, and as men see more and more clearly what the future is to it, able organizers will take lower salaries for municipal than for private employment, whilst those who can beat even the municipality at organizing, or who, as professional men, can deal personally with the public without the intervention of industrial organization, will pay the rent of their places of business either directly to the municipality or to the private landlord whose income the municipality will absorb by taxation. Finally, when rents of ability have reached their irreducible natural level, they could be dealt with by a progressive income tax in the very improbable case of their proving a serious social inconvenience. It is not necessary to go further into the economic detail of the process of the extinction of private property. Much of that process, as sketched here, may be anticipated by sections of the proprietary class successively capitulating, as the net closes about their special interests, on such terms as they may be able to stand out for before their power is entirely broken. Footnote 95. Such capitulations occur already when the Chancellor of the Exchequer takes advantage of the fall in the current rate of interest, explained on page 20, to reduce consols. This he does by simply threatening to pay off the stockholders with money freshly borrowed at the current rate. They, knowing that they could not reinvest the money on any better terms than the reduced ones offered by the Chancellor, have to submit. There is no reason why the municipality should not secure the same advantages for their constituents. For example, the inhabitants of London now pay the shareholders of the gas companies $1.5 million annually, or 11% on the £13,650,000 which the gas works cost. The London County Council could raise that sum for about £400,000 a year. By threatening to do this and start municipal gas works, it could obviously compel the shareholders to hand over their works for £400,000 a year and sacrifice the extra 8% now enjoyed by them. The saving to the citizens of London would be £1 million a year, sufficient to defray the net cost of the London School Board. Metropolitan readers will find a number of cognate instances in Fabian Tract number 8, Facts for Londoners. We may also safely neglect for the moment the question of the development of the House of Commons into the central government, which will be the organ for federating the municipalities and nationalizing intermunicipal rents by an adjustment of the municipal contributions to imperial taxation. In short, for discharging national as distinct from local business. One can see that the local government board of the future will be a tremendous affair, that foreign states will be deeply affected by the reaction of English progress, that international trade, always the really dominant factor in foreign policy, will have to be reconsidered from a new point of view when profit comes to be calculated in terms of net social welfare instead of individual pecuniary gain, that our present system of imperial aggression, in which under pretext of exploration and colonization, the flag follows the filibuster and trade follows the flag, with the missionary bringing up the rear, must collapse when the control of our military forces passes from the capitalist class to the people, that the disappearance of a variety of classes with a variety of what are now ridiculously called public opinions will be accompanied by the welding of society into one class with a public opinion of inconceivable weight, that this public opinion will make it for the first time possible effectively to control the population, that the economic independence of women and the supplanting of the head of the household by the individual as a recognized unit of the state will materially alter the status of children and the utility of the institution of the family, and that the inevitable reconstitution of the state church on a democratic basis may, for example, open up the possibility of the election of an avowed free thinker like Mr. John Morley or Mr. Bradlaugh to the deanery of Westminster. All these things are mentioned only for the sake of a glimpse of the fertile fields of thought and action which await us when the settlement of our bread and butter question leaves us free to use and develop our higher faculties. This, then, is the humdrum program of the practical social democrat today. There is not one new item in it. All our applications of principles already admitted and extensions of practices already in full activity. All have on them that stamp of the vestry which is so congenial to the British mind. None of them compel the use of the words socialism or revolution. At no point do they involve guillotining, declaring the rights of man, swearing on the altar of the country, or anything else that is supposed to be essentially un-English. And they are all sure to come, landmarks on our course already visible to far-sighted politicians, even of the party which dreads them. Let me, in conclusion, disavow all admiration for this inevitable, but sordid, slow, reluctant, cowardly path to justice. I venture to claim your respect for those enthusiasts who still refuse to believe that millions of their fellow creatures must be left to sweat and suffer in hopeless toil and degradation, whilst parliaments and vestries grudgingly muddle and grope towards paltry installments of betterment. The right is so clear, the wrong so intolerable, the gospel so convincing, that it seems to them that it must be possible to enlist the whole body of workers, soldiers, policemen, and all, under the banner of brotherhood and equality, and at one great stroke to set justice on her rightful throne. Unfortunately, such an army of light is no more to be gathered from the human product of 19th century civilization than grapes are to be gathered from thistles. But if we feel glad of that impossibility, if we feel relieved that the change is to be slow enough to avert personal risk to ourselves, if we feel anything less than acute disappointment and bitter humiliation at the discovery that there is yet between us and the promised land a wilderness in which many must perish miserably of want and despair, then I submit to you that our institutions have corrupted us to the most dastardly degree of selfishness. The socialists need not be ashamed of beginning, as they did, by proposing militant organization of the working classes and general insurrection. The proposal proved unpractical, and it has now been abandoned, not without some unspoken regrets, by English socialists. But it still remains as the only finally possible alternative to the social democratic program which I have sketched today. End of section 15, read by Brize Cries, Youngstown.
Section 16 of Fabian Essays in Socialism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mark Leader. Fabian Essays in Socialism, edited by George Bernard Shaw. Section 16. The Outlook. Mr. Webb's historical review brought us from the breakup of the old synthesis, his own phrase, a social system founded on a basis of religion, a common belief in a divine order, to the point where perplexed politicians, recognizing the futility of the principle of individualism to keep the industrial machine in working order, with freedom of contract upon their lips, spent their nights in passing factory acts, and devoted their fiscal ingenuity to cutting slice after slice off incomes derived from rent and interest. His paper was an inductive demonstration of the failure of anarchy to meet the needs of real, concrete men and women, a proof from history that the world moves from system through disorder back again to system. Mr. Clark showed us, also by the historic method, that given a few more years of economic progress on present lines, and we shall reach, via the ring and the trust, that period of well-defined confrontation of the rich and poor upon which German thought has settled as the brief stage of sociological evolution immediately preceding organic change. The truth of this postulate of Teutonic philosophers and economists, no one who has given to it a moment's serious thought is likely to call in question, nor does anyone who has followed the argument developed in these lectures believe that the transition from mitigated individualism to full collectivity can be made until the capitalist system has worked itself out to its last logical expression. Till then, no political or social upheaval, however violent, nay, even though the physical force revolutionists should chase the guards helter-skelter down Parliament Street, and the executive committee of the Fabian Society hold its meetings in the council chamber of Windsor Castle, will be anything more than one of those transient riots spoken of by Mrs. Besant, which merely upset thrones and behead monarchs. All sociologists, I think, all socialists, I am sure, are agreed that until the economic moment has arrived, until the hungry or the ignorant may kick up a dust in Whitechapel and make a bloody puddle in Trafalgar Square, the social revolution is impossible. But I, for my part, do not believe in the even temporary rout of the household brigade, nor indeed in any popular outbreak not easily suppressible by the metropolitan police. And I shall waste no time in discussing that solution of the social problem of which more was heard in the salad days of the English socialist movement, in its pre-Fabian era, than now, viz., physical force employed by a vigorous few. The physical force man, like the privileged Tory, has failed to take note of the flux of things and to recognize the change brought about by the ballot. Under a larger franchise, the barricade is the last resort of a small and desperate minority, a frank confession of despair, a reduction to absurdity of the whole socialist case. Revolutionary heroics, natural and unblameable enough in exuberant puerility, are imbecile babblement in muscular adolescence, and in manhood would be criminal folly. Let us assume, then, that the present economic progress will continue on its present lines, that machinery will go on replacing hand labor, that the joint stock company will absorb the private firm to be in its turn swallowed up in the ring and the trust, that thus the smaller producers and distributors will gradually, but at a constantly increasing pace, be squeezed out and reduced to the condition of employees of great industrial and trade corporations managed by highly skilled captains of industry in the interests of idle shareholders. In a parliamentarian state like ours, the economic cleavage, which divides the proprietors from the propertyless, ever growing wider and more clearly defined, must have its analog in the world of politics. The revolution of the last century, which ended in the installation of the grand industry, was the last of the great unconscious world changes. It was helped by legislation, of course, but the help was only of the negative and destructive sort. "Break our fetters and let us alone," was the cry of the revolutionists to Parliament. The lawmakers, not knowing quite what they were doing, responded, and then blithely contracted debts and voted money for commercial wars. Such a sight will never be seen again. The repeated extension of the suffrage has done more than make the industrial masses articulate. It has given them consciousness. And for the future, the echo of the voices of those who suffer from economic changes will be heard clamoring for relief within the walls of St. Stephen's and the urban guild halls. Thus, the coming struggle between haves and have-nots will be a conflict of parties, each perfectly conscious of what is fighting about and fully alive to the life and death importance of the issues at stake. I say will be, for one has only to read a few speeches of political leaders or attend a discussion at a workman's club to be convinced that at present it is only the keener and more alert minds on either side which are more than semi-conscious of the true nature of the campaign, of which the first shots may even now be heard at every by-election. But as nothing makes one so entirely aware of one's own existence as a sharp spasm of pain, so it is to the suffering, the hunger, the despair of tomorrow's dinner, the anxiety about the next new pair of trousers, wrought by the increasing economic pressure upon the enfranchised and educated proletariat, that we must look to awaken that free self-consciousness which will give the economic changes political expression and enable the worker to make practical use of the political weapons which are his. The outlook, then, from the point of view of this paper is a political one in which we should expect to see the world political gradually become a reflex of the world economic. That political should be slow in coming into line with economic facts is only in accordance with all that the past history of our country has to teach us. For years and decades, the squirearchy retained an influence in the House of Commons out of all proportion to its potency as an economic force. And even at this moment, the landed interest bears a much larger part in lawmaking than that to which its real importance entitles it. Therefore, we must be neither surprised nor dispirited if in a cold-blooded envisagement of the condition of English parties, the truth is borne in upon us that the pace of political progress has no proper relation to the rate at which we are traveling towards socialism in the spheres of thought and industry. This fact is probably, nay, almost certainly, very much more patent to the socialist and the political student than to the man in the street, or even to him of the first-class railway carriage. The noisy jubilation of the radical press over the victory of a home ruler at a by-election, at a brief and vague reference to the homes of the people in a 2-hour speech from a liberal leader, or at the insertion of a social plank in a new annual program, is well and cleverly calculated to beguile the ardent Democrat and strike cold terror to the heart of the timorous Tory. But a perfectly impartial analysis of the present state of parties will convince the most sanguine that the breadth of the great economic changes dealt with in Mr. Clark's paper has as yet scarcely ruffled the surface of the House of Commons. When the syllabus of this course of lectures was drawn up, those who were responsible for it suggested as the first subheading of this paper the well-worn phrase, "the disappearance of the wig." It is a happy expression, and one from the contemplation of which much comfort can be derived by an optimistic and unanalytical temperament. Printed are at this disadvantage compared with spoken words. They fail to convey the nicer nuances of meaning bestowed by tone and emphasis, and thus the word disappearance meets the eye, carrying with it no slightest suggestion of irony. Yet the phrase is pointless, if not meant sarcastic, for so far is the Whig from disappearing that he is the greatest political fact of the day. To persons deafened by the daily democratic shouting of the radical newspapers, this assertion may require some confirmation and support. Let us look at the facts, then. the first thing which strikes us in connection with the present Parliament is that it no longer consists of two distinct parties, that is, of two bodies of men differentiated from each other by the holding of fundamentally different principles. Home rule left out, there remains no reason whatever, except the quite minor question of disestablishment, why even the simulacrum of party organizations should be maintained, or why the structural arrangements of the House of Commons should not be so altered as to resemble those of a town hall, in which all the seats face the chair. But 50 years ago, the floor of the House was a frontier of genuine significance, and the titles Whig and Tory were word symbols of real inward and spiritual facts. The Tory party was mostly made up of men who were conscientiously opposed to popular representation and prepared to stand or fall by their opposition. They held as a living political creed that the government of men was the eternal heritage of the rich, and especially of those whose riches spelt rent. The Whigs, on the other hand, believed, or said they believed, in the aphorism Vox Populi, Vox Dei, and they on the whole consistently advocated measures designed to give that voice a distincter and louder utterance. Here, then, was one of those fundamental differences in the absence of which party nomenclature is a sham. But there was another. In the first half of this century, the Tories, hidebound in historic traditions and deaf to the knell of the old regime tolling in the thud of the piston rods of the new steam engines, clung pathetically to the old idea of the functions of the state and to territorial rights. The Whigs went for laissez-faire and the consequent supremacy of the businessman. I'm making a perfectly provable proposition when I say that all the political disputes which arose between the Revolution of 1688 and the enfranchisement of the 10-pound householder by Disraeli had their common cause in one of these two root differences. But the battle has long ago been lost and won. The Whigs have triumphed all along the line. The Tories have not only been beaten, they have been absorbed. A process has gone on like that described by Macaulay as following on the Norman invasion, when men gradually ceased to call themselves Saxon and Norman and proudly boasted of being English. The difference in the case before us is that while the Tories have accepted the whole of the Whig principles, they still abjure the Whig name. No so-called conservative today will venture on opposing an extension of the franchise on the plain ground of principle. At most, he will but temporize and plead for delay. No blush of conscious inconsistency suffused Mr. Ritchie's swarthy features when introducing his frankly democratic local government bill. And rightly not, for he was doing no violence to party principles. In the matter of the functions of the state, the absorption of the Tory is not quite so obvious, because there never has been, and as long as society lasts, never can be, a parti sérieux of logical laissez-faire. Even in the thick of the Industrial Revolution, the difference between the two great parties was mainly one of tendency, of attitude of mind. The Tory had a certain affection for the state, a natural self-love. The Whig distrusted it. This distrust is now the sentiment of the whole of our public men. They see, some of them perhaps more clearly than others, that there is much the state must do, but they all wish that much to be as little as possible, even when driven by an irresistible force which they feel but do not understand, which none but the socialist does or can understand. They bring forward measures for increasing the power of the whole over the part. Their arguments are always suffused in a sickly halo of apology. Their gestures are always those of timorous deprecation and fretful diffidence. They are always nervously anxious to explain that the proposal violates no principle of political economy, and with them political economy means not Professor Sidgwick, but Adam Smith. The reason why this unanimity of all prominent politicians on great fundamental principles is not manifest to the mind of the average man is that, although there is nothing left to get hot or even moderately warm about, the political temperature is as high as ever. It is not in the dust of the arena, but only in the repose of the auditorium that one is able to realize that men will fight as fiercely and claw each other as spitefully over a dry bone as over a living principle. One has to stand aside a while to see that politicians are like the theological controversialists, of whom Professor Seeley somewhere says that they never get so angry with each other as when their differences are almost imperceptible, except perhaps when they are quite so. Both the efficient and the final cause of this unanimity is a sort of unconscious or semi-conscious recognition of the fact that the word state has taken to itself new and diverse connotations, that the state idea has changed its content. Whatever state control may have meant 50 years ago, it never meant hostility to private property as such. Now, for us, and for as far ahead as we can see, it means that and little else. So long as the state interfered with the private property and powers of one set of proprietors with a view only to increasing those of another, the existence of parties for and against such interference was a necessity of the case. A duty on foreign corn meant the keeping up of incomes drawn from rent. Its abolition meant a rise of manufacturers' profits. Free trade swelled the purses of the new bourgeoisie. The factory acts depleted them and gave a sweet revenge to the rent-docked squire. But of this manipulation of the legislative machine for proprietors' purposes, we are at, or at least in sight of, the end. The state has grown bigger by an immense aggregation of units who were once to all intents and purposes separate from it, and now its action generally points not to a readjustment of private property and privileges as between class and class, but to their complete disappearance. So then the instinct which is welding together the propertied politicians is truly self-preservative. But it may be asked by the bewildered radical, by the tremulous conservative, by the optimistic socialist, if the political leaders are really opposed to state augmentation, how comes it that every new measure of reform introduced into the House of Commons is more or less colored with socialism, and that no popular speaker will venture to address a public meeting without making some reference of a socialistic sort to the social problem? Why, for instance, does that extremely well-oiled and accurately poised political weathercock, Sir William Harcourt, pointing to the drawn crow out that we are all socialists now? To these questions, and I have not invented them, I answer, in the first place, because the opposition of the political leaders is instinctive, and only as yet semi-conscious, even in the most hypocritical. In the second place, that a good deal of the legislative socialism appears more in words than in deeds. In the third place, that the famous flourish of Sir William Harcourt was a rhetorical falsehood. And fourthly, because fortunately for the progress of mankind, self-preservative instincts are not peculiar to the propertied classes. For it is largely instinctive and wholly self-preservative. This change in the proposition of the working people towards the state, this change by which, from fearing it as an actual enemy, they have come to look to it as a potential savior. I know that this assertion will be violently denied by many of my socialist brethren. The fly on the wheel not unnaturally feels wounded at being told that he is, after all, not the motive power, and the igniferous orators of the Socialist Party are welcome, so far as I am concerned, to all the comfort they can get from imagining that they, and not any great blind evolutionary forces, are the dynamic of the social revolution. Besides, The metaphor of the fly really does not run on all fours. I forget for the moment how many legs a fly has. For the socialist does at least know in what direction the car is going, even though he is not the driving force. Yet it seems to me the part being and to be played by the socialist is notable enough in all conscience, for it is he who is turning instinct into self-conscious reason, voicing a dumb demand and giving intelligent direction to a thought wave of terrific potency. There is a true cleavage being slowly driven through the body politic, but the wedge is still beneath the surface. The signs of its workings are to be found in the reactionary measures of pseudo-reform advocated by many prominent politicians, in the really socialist proposals of some of the obscurer men, and in the growing distaste of the political clubman for a purely political pabulum, and in the receptive attitude of a certain portion of the cultivated middle class towards the outpourings of the Fabian Society. This conscious recognition of the meaning of modern tendencies, this defining of the new line of cleavage, while it is the wellspring of most of the socialist hopes, is no less the source of some lively fear. At present, it is only the acuter and more far-seeing of the minds amongst the property classes who are at all alive to the real nature of the attack. One has but to listen to the chatter of the average liberal candidate to note how hopelessly blind the man is to the fact that the existence of private property in the means of production forms any factor at all in the social problem. And what is true of the rank and file is true only in a less degree of the chiefs themselves. Ignorance of economics and inability to shake their minds free of 18th century political philosophy at present hinders the leaders of the Party of Progress from taking up a definite position either for or against the advance of the new ideas. The number of English statesmen who, like Prince Bismarck, see in socialism a swelling tide whose oceanic rush must be broken by timely legislative breakwaters is still only to be expressed by a minus quantity. But this political myopia is not destined to endure. Every additional vote cast for avowed socialist candidates at municipal and other elections will help to bring home to the minds of the liberals that the section of the new democracy which regards the ballot merely as a war engine with which to attack capitalism is a growing one. At last our liberal will be face to face with a logical but irritating choice, either to throw over private capital or to frankly acknowledge that it is a distinction without a difference which separates him from the conservatives against whom he has for years been fulminating. At first sight, it looks as though this political moment in the history of the Liberal Party would be one eminently auspicious for the socialist cause. But although I have a lively faith in the victory of logic in the long run, I have an equally vivid knowledge that to assure the triumph that the run must be a very long one. And above all, I have a profound respect for the staying powers of politicians and their ability to play a waiting game. It is one thing to offer a statesman the choice of one of two logical courses. It is another to prevent his seeing a third and an illogical one and going for it. Such prevention in the present case will be so difficult as to be well nigh impossible. For the liberal hand still holds a strong suit, the cards political. It is quite certain that the social program of our party will become a great fact long before all the purely political proposals of the liberals have received the royal assent, and the game of the politician will be to hinder the adoption of the former by noisily hustling forward the latter. Unfortunately for us, it will be an easy enough game to play. The scent of the non-socialist politicians for political red herrings is keen, and his appetite for political Dead Sea fruit prodigious. The number of blessed words, the mere sound of which carries content to his soul, would fill a whole page. In an age of self-seeking, his pathetic self-abnegation would be refreshing, were it not so desperately silly. The young artisan on 25 shillings a week, who with his wife and children occupies 2 rooms in a model, and who is about as likely to become a llama as a leaseholder, will shout himself hoarse over leaseholds enfranchisement, and sweat great drops of indignation at the plunder of rich West End tradesmen by rich West End landlords. The out of work, whose last shirt is in pawn, will risk his skull's integrity in Trafalgar Square in defense of Mr. O'Brien's claim to dress in jail like a gentleman. Of course, all this is very touching. Indeed, to be quite serious, it indicates a nobility of character and breadth of human sympathy in which lies our hope of social salvation. But its infinite potentiality must not blind us to the fact that in its actuality, the dodgy liberal will see his chance of the indefinite postponement of the socializing of politics. Manhood suffrage, female suffrage, the woes of deceased wives, sisters, the social ambition of dissenting ministers, the legal obstacles to the free acquirement of landed property, home rule for dear old Scotland and neglected little Wales, extraordinary tithes, reform of the House of Lords, all these and any number of other obstacles may be successfully thrown in the way of the forward march of the socialist army. And the worst of it all is that in a great part of his obstructive tactics, the liberal will have us on the hip. For to out-and-out democratization we are fully pledged, and must needs back up any attack on hereditary or class privilege, come it from what quarter it may. But to get back to our metaphor of the card table, a metaphor much more applicable to the games of political men, the political suit does not exhaust the liberal hand. There still remains a card to play, a veritable trump. Sham Socialism is the name of it, and Mr. John Morley the man to plank it down. I have said above that the trend of things to socialism is best shown by the changed attitude of men towards state interference and control, and this is true. Still, it must not be forgotten that although socialism involves state control does not imply socialism, at least in any modern meaning of the term. It is not so much to the thing that state does as to the end for which it does it that we must look before we can decide whether it is a socialist state or not. Socialism is the common holding of the means of production and exchange, and the holding of them for the equal benefit of all. In view of the tone now being adopted by some of us, I cannot too strongly insist upon the importance of this distinction, for the losing sight of it by friends and its intentional obscuration by enemies constitute a big and immediate danger. To bring forward sixpenny telegrams as an instance of state socialism may be a very good method of scoring a point off an individualist opponent in a debate before a middle-class audience. But from the standpoint of the proletariat, a piece of state management which spares the pockets only of the commercial and leisured classes is no more socialism than were the droit de seigneur of the Middle Ages. Yet this is the sort of sham socialism which it is as certain as death will be doled out by the popular party in the hope that mere state action will be mistaken for really socialist legislation. And the objects of these givers of Greek gifts will most infallibly be attained if those socialists who know what they want hesitate from fear of losing popularity or from any more amiable weakness to clamor their loudest against any kind and every proposal whose adoption would prolong the life of private capital a single hour. But leaving sham socialism altogether out of account, there are other planks in the liberal and radical program which would make stubborn barriers in the paths of the destroyers of private capital. Should, for instance, church disestablishment come upon us while the personnel of the House of Commons is at all like what it is at present, few things are more certain than that a good deal of what is now essentially collective property will pass into private hands, that the number of individuals interested in upholding ownership will be increased, and that the only feelings gratified will be the acquisitiveness of these persons and the envy of little Bethel. Again, the general state of mind of the radical on the land question is hardly such as to make a socialist hilarious. It is true your progressive will cheer Henry George and is sympathetically inclined to nationalization, itself a blessed word. But he is not at all sure that nationalization, free land, and peasant proprietorship are not three names for one and the same proposal. And so far as the effective members of the Liberal Party are concerned, there is no question at all but the second and third of these solutions find much more favor than the first. In fact, in this matter of the land, the method of dealing with which is of the very propaedeutics of socialism, the radical who goes for free sale or for peasant ownership is a less potent revolutionary force than the Tory himself. For this latter only seeks to maintain in land the state of things which the ring and trust maker is working to bring about in capital, and on the part of which he is playing in economic evolution, we are all agreed. From such dangers as these, the progress of democracy is by itself powerless to save us. For although always and everywhere democracy holds socialism in its womb, the birth may be indefinitely delayed by stupidity on one side and acuteness on the other. I have gone at some length into an analysis of the possible artificial hindrances to socialism because, owing to the amiability and politeness shown us by the radical left wing during the last 12 months, to the successes which radical votes have given to some of our candidates at school board and other elections, and to the friendly patronage bestowed upon us by certain advanced journals, some of our brightest and otherwise most clear-sighted spirits have begun to base high hopes upon what they call the permeation of the Liberal Party. These of our brothers have a way of telling us that the transition to socialism will be so gradual as to be imperceptible, and there will never come a day when we shall be able to say, now we have a socialist state. They are fond of likening the simpler among us who disagree with them as to the extreme protraction of the process to children who, having been told that when it rains a cloud falls, looks disappointedly out of the window on a wet day, unconscious that the cloud is falling before their eyes in the shape of drops of water. To these cautious souls I reply that although there is much truth in their contention that the process will be gradual, we shall be able to say that we have a socialist state on the day on which no man or group of men holds over the means of production property rights by which the labor of the producers can be subjected to exploitation, and that while their picturesque metaphor is a happy as well as a poetic conceit, it depends upon the political acumen of the present and next generation of socialist men whether the cloud shall fall in refreshing socialist showers or in a dreary drizzle of radicalism, bringing with it more smuts than water, fouling everything and cleansing nowhere. This permeation of the radical left, undoubted fact though it is of present-day politics, is worth a little further attention, for there are two possible and tenable views as to its final outcome. One is that it will end in the slow absorption of the socialist in the Liberal Party, and that by the action of this sponge-like organism, the whole of the rent and interest will pass into collective control without there ever having been the party definitely and openly pledged to that end. According to this theory, there will come a time, and that shortly, when the avowed socialists and the much socialized radicals will be strong enough to hold the balance in many constituencies and sufficiently powerful in all to drive the advanced candidate many pegs further than his own inclination would take him. Then, either by abstention or by actual support of the reactionary champion at elections, they will be able to threaten the liberals with certain defeat. The liberals, being traditionally squeezable folk, like all absorbent bodies, will thus be forced to make concessions and to offer compromises, and will either adopt a certain minimum number of the socialistic proposals or allow to socialists a share in the representation itself. Such concessions and compromises will grow in number and importance with each successive appeal to the electorate until at last the game is won. Now, it seems to me that these hopefuls allow their desires to distort their reason. The personal equation plays too large a part in the prophecy. They are generally either not yet wholly socialized radicals or socialists who have quite recently broken away from mere political radicalism and are still largely under the influence of party ties and traditions. They find it almost impossible to believe that the party with which they acted so long, so conscientiously, and with so much satisfaction to themselves is, after all, not the party to which belongs the future. They are, in many cases, on terms of intimate private friendship with some of the lesser lights of radicalism, and occasionally bask in the patronizing radiance shed by the larger luminaries. A certain portion of the advanced press is open to them for the expression of their views political. Of course, none of these considerations are at all to their discredit or reflect in the very least upon their motives or sincerity, but they do color their judgment and cause them to reckon without their host. They are a little apt to forget that a good deal of the democratic program has yet, as I have said above, to be carried. Manhood suffrage, the abolition of the Lords, disestablishment, the payment of members, all these may be and are quite logically desired by men who cling as pertinaciously to private capital as the doughtiest knight of the Primrose League. Such men regard the vital articles of the socialist creed as lying altogether outside the concrete world, the sphere of practical politics. Meanwhile, the socialist votes and voices are well within that sphere, and it is every day becoming more evident that without them, the above-mentioned aspirations have a meager chance of realization. Now, from the eminently business-like liberal standpoint, there's no reason whatever why concessions should not be made to the socialist at the polling booth, so long as none are asked for in the House of Commons. And even when they are demanded, what easier than to make some burning political question play the part which Home Rule is playing now? Thus an endless vista of office opens before the glowing eyes of the practical politician, those short-sighted eyes which see so little beyond the nose, and which at that distance only enable their owner to hit the white. The radical is right, as usual, in counting on the Socialist Alliance up to a certain point. For us, the complete democratization of institutions is a political necessity. But long before that complete democratization has been brought about, we shall have lost our patience and the radicals their temper. For as Mr. Hinman tells the world with damnable but most veracious iteration, we are a growing party. We recruit by driblets, but we do recruit. And those who come to us come, like all the new American newspapers, to stay. Our faith, our reason, our knowledge tell us that the great revolutionary forces are with us, and every addition to our ranks causes us, in geometrical proportion, to be less and less tolerant of political prevarication. Directly we feel ourselves strong enough to have the slightest chance of winning off our own bat, we shall be compelled both by principle and inclination to send an 11 to the wickets. They will have to face the opposition, united or disunited, of both the orthodox parties, as did the defeated socialist candidates at the school board election in November 1888. And whether our success be great or small, or even non-existent, we shall be denounced by the radical wire pullers and the now so complacent and courteous radical press. The alliance will be at an end. There is yet another way in which we may win the ill will of our temporary allies and at present very good friends. I have spoken above of certain reactionary items of a possible radical program, which, although they have a grotesque resemblance to socialism, are worlds away from being the thing itself. These proposals we not only cannot support, but must and shall actively and fiercely oppose. At the first signs of such opposition to whoever may be the liberal shepherd of the moment, the whole flock of party sheep will be in full cry upon our track. The ferocity of the mouton enragé is proverbial, and we shall be treated to the same rancor, spleen, and bile which is now so plenteously meted out to the liberal unionists. The immediate result of this inevitable split will be the formation of a definitely socialist party. That is, a party pledged to the communalization of all the means of production and exchange and prepared to subordinate every other consideration to that one end. Then the House of Commons will begin dimly to reflect the real condition of the nation outside, and in it we shall see as in a glass darkly, or smudgedly, something of that well-defined confrontation of rich and poor, of which all who attend socialist lectures hear so much, and to which, ex hypothesi, the world day by day draws nearer. Then also will begin that process which, I submit, is more likely than either the absorption of the socialist or the prolonged permeation of the radical, namely, the absorption of the radical himself into the definitely pro-private capital party on the one side and the definitely anti-private capital party on the other. A really homogenous socialist party once formed, the world political reflects the world economic, and there is no longer any room for the radical, as we know the wonder. Each fresh socialist victory, each outpost driven in, each entrenchment carried, will be followed by a Warren-like scuttle of alarmed and well-to-do radicals across the floor of the House of Commons, which will once more become a true frontier. And finally, the political battle array will consist of a small opposition fronting a great and powerful majority, made up of all those whose real or fancied interests would suffer by expropriation. Thus far, the outlook has been clear and focusable enough, and it has needed no extra-human illumination to see the details. All that has been wanted has been normal vision and a mind fairly free of the idols of the cave. But here the prospect becomes dim and uncertain, and little purpose would be served by trying to pierce the mist which enshrouds the distant future. Much, very much will depend upon the courage, the magnanimity, the steadfastness, the tact, the foresight, and above all upon the incorruptibility of those whose high mission will be to frame the policy and direct the strategy of the Socialist Party in those early days of its parliamentary life. It will have sore need of a leader as able as and more conscientious than any of the great parliamentary figures of the past. The eye expectant searches in vain for such a man, now amongst the younger broods of the new democracy. He is probably at this moment in his cradle, or equitably sharing out toys or lollipops to his comrades of the nursery. And this is well, for he must be a man quit of all recollections of these days of Sturm und Drang, of petty jealousies, constant errors, and failing faith. He must bring to his task a record free from failure and without suspicion of stain. But whatever may be the difficulties in store for us who name the name of socialism, of one thing at least they who have followed this course of lectures may make quite sure: that, however long and wearisome the struggle, each day brings us nearer victory. Those who resist socialism fight against principalities and powers in economic places. Every new industrial development will add point to our arguments and soldiers to our ranks. The continuous perfecting of the organization of labor will hourly quicken in the worker the consciousness that his is a collective, not an individual life. The proletariat is even now the only real class. Its units are the only human beings who have nothing to hope for save from a leveling up of the aggregate of which they form a part. The intensifying of the struggle for existence, while it sets bourgeois at the throat of bourgeois, is forcing union and solidarity upon the workers. And the bourgeois ranks themselves are dwindling. The keenness of competition, making it every year more obviously impossible for those who are born without capital ever to achieve it, will deprive the capitalist class of a support it now receives from educated and cultivated but impecunious young men, whose material interest must finally triumph over their class sympathies. And from that section of workmen whose sole aspiration is to struggle out of the crowd. The rising generation of wage workers, instead of as now being befogged and bedeviled by the dust and smoke of mere faction fight, will be able at a glance to distinguish the uniforms of friend and foe. Despair will take sides with hope in doing battle for the socialist cause. These lectures have made it plain enough to those who have hearing ears and understanding brains that mere material self-interest alone will furnish a motive strong enough to shatter monopoly. And after monopoly comes socialism or chaos. But the interest of a smaller self is not the only force which aids us in the present or will guide us in the future. The angels are on our side. The constant presence of a vast mass of human misery is generating in the educated classes a deep discontent, a spiritual unrest which drives the lower types to pessimism, the higher to inquiry. Pessimism paralyzes the arms and unnerves the hearts of those who would be against us. Inquiry proves that socialism is founded upon a triple rock: historical, ethical, and economic. It gives to those who make it a great hope, a hope which, once it finds entrance into the heart of man, stays to soften life and sweeten death. By the light of the socialist ideal, he sees the evil, yet sees it pass. Then and now, he begins to live in the cleaner, braver, holier life of the future, and he marches forward, steeled and stimulated, with resolute step, with steadfast eye, with equal pulse. It is just when the storm winds blow and the clouds lower and the horizon is at its blackest that the ideal of a socialist shines with divinest radiance, bidding him trust the inspiration of the poet rather than heed the mutterings of the perplexed politician, bidding him believe that, for all that, it's coming yet for all that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be for all that. This ends section 16. End of Fabian Essays in Socialism, edited by George Bernard Shaw.